There are moments in a man's life that divide everything into before and after. Before the war, after the war, before the gates opened, after the gates opened, before she walked in, after she walked in. Colt Decker had lived through enough of those moments to stop counting them. He had learned the hard way that the ones that mattered most rarely announced themselves. They did not arrive with sirens or thunder. They arrived like her quietly on the clack of a wooden cane across a hardwood floor in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon when a man least expected his world to shift beneath his boots. But we are not there yet. We are in a garage first. A single garage attached to the back of a building that smelled of motor oil and old wood and decades of decisions that could not be undone. The hour was late. A fluorescent light above hummed and flickered, the way fluorescent lights always do in places where important things have happened, as if the electricity itself is uncertain whether to stay or go. Colt Decker stood at the center of that garage alone. He was a large man, 6 feet and 4 inches of bone, and consequence with a beard that had gone from black to iron gray somewhere in the last decade without him noticing or caring. His hands were the hands of a man who had worked with them his entire life, wide across the palms, scarred at the knuckles, darkened with oil, that no amount of scrubbing ever fully removed. Those hands rested now on the tank of a motorcycle, a 1958 Harley-Davidson Panhead. The tank was painted a deep liquid midnight blue, and along its flank ran a lightning bolt in faded silver, barely visible beneath the new coat of lacquer the boys had laid down over 3 careful weeks. It was the most beautiful machine Colt Decker had ever seen in his 48 years on this earth. And he was crying, not the way men cry in movies with dignity and a single cinematic tear. He was crying the way men cry when they believe no one is watching, shoulders dropped, jaw clenched against the sound eyes squeezed shut against the light. His right hand pressed flat against the curve of the tank as if the metal were warm, as if it were alive, as if pressing hard enough might let something pass between his palm and the steel. Some message, some answer, some peace. The engine had been rebuilt from a bare block. The chrome on the fishtail exhaust was mirror bright. The leather of the seat had been hand-tooled by Bear Malone, who had never hand-tooled leather before in his life, but had watched 4 hours of instructional video and then simply sat down and done it the way Bear did most things, without ceremony, without announcement, with complete and total commitment. The tires were new. The suicide shifter gleamed. The spokes of both wheels had been polished one by one individually by Razor Tully, who had complained every single night for 3 weeks about his back and had not stopped doing it for even one of those nights. It had taken the club 91 days. It had cost them $20,000 they did not technically have and had produced from sources that did not technically exist. Standing in front of it now, Colt Decker pressed his forehead against the cool metal of the tank and breathed. Just breathed. Outside Route 66 was quiet. The desert was quiet. Everything was quiet except the flicker of the light and the sound of a man coming to terms with something that had taken 40 years to arrive. The narrator speaks low and unhurried, the voice of someone who has earned the right to take their time. I have seen hard men broken by many things in my life. By war, by betrayal, by the particular loneliness that comes from outliving everyone who understood you. But I had never seen a man cry over a motorcycle. Not until I understood what was inside it. Not until I understood who had brought it back. Not until I understood what a 72-year-old woman with a wooden cane and a red leather handbag had done to the most dangerous motorcycle club in the state of Arizona, armed with nothing but a 40-year-old secret and the courage of someone who has already been told they are dying and has simply decided not to be afraid of anything anymore. This is where it ended. Let us go back to where it began, October 2013, 5 months before this garage. 5 months before this bike stood finished under this light. 5 months before Colt Decker understood what he had been waiting to do since 2001, though he could not have named it that way at the time. The time was 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and the temperature outside the Iron Horse Saloon was 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The asphalt of the parking lot was soft enough that boot heels left impressions in it. The air above Route 66 shimmered like the surface of a lake. The saguaro cactus along the roadside stood in the heat with the patient indifference of things that have survived worse than this and will continue to survive long after everything else has turned to dust. The Iron Horse Saloon sat approximately 20 miles outside of Kingman, Arizona, at a junction that appeared on no tourist map and was not meant to. It was a building that had been added to over 4 decades, a room here, a storage bay there, a covered porch enclosed with corrugated metal sheeting during a particularly ambitious weekend in 1987. until it had grown into something that defied any single architectural description. It simply was what it was. A place for men who did not need it explained to them. Inside, the air conditioner rattled with the dedication of a machine that refused to accept its own failure. It fought the desert heat, and it lost, but it fought. The air inside was thick cigarette smoke layered over the smell of stale beer, the iron undercurrent of motor oil that had soaked into every wooden surface over the years, the human smell of men who spent most of their waking hours outdoors in physical labor and had made a private peace with that fact. The jukebox in the corner played something slow and southern. The pool table in the back held an abandoned game, the balls scattered as though the players had simply walked away mid-shot, which they had. 3 ceiling fans turned overhead, moving the smoke rather than dispersing it, rearranging the haze the way you might rearrange furniture in a room that is fundamentally too small, technically productive, practically useless. At the center table sat Colt Decker. He sat the way he always sat, back to the wall, eyes on the door. This was not a posture he had chosen consciously in many years. It had long since moved from habit to instinct, which is what happens to the things that keep you alive long enough. They stop being decisions and become the shape of you. Colt Decker was 48 years old and looked every year of it in the best possible sense. Not worn out, but worn in the way good leather looks after 20 years of weather. His beard was the color of iron filings. His forearms resting on the table were covered in ink that told a history in fragments, names and dates and symbols whose meanings existed only between him and the moments that had produced them. On his back, beneath the leather vest that had conformed to the shape of his shoulders over decades, was the death's head patch of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club Mojave chapter. He was the chapter president, had been for 9 years, had earned it in the way that earned things are earned, not by asking for it, not by being given it, but by being the man who was still standing when the chair needed filling, and everyone else looked at him and simply knew. To his left sat Razor Tully. Razor was 45, lean in the way that suggested a body that had never carried anything unnecessary, with a scar that ran from below his left ear to the corner of his jaw, the product of a disagreement in Flagstaff in 2004 that had been resolved thoroughly, if not neatly. Razor was the club's lieutenant, the man who translated Colt's decisions into action and ensured that the action happened correctly, efficiently, and without the loose ends that attracted federal attention. To Colt's right sat Bear Malone. Bear weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 pounds, and he wore it the way certain large men do, not as excess but as architecture, as though his body had decided that more of him was required and had organized itself accordingly. Bear was 42, the youngest man at the table, and also somehow the most fundamentally decent. There was something in his face that the years of club life had not fully erased, an openness, an absence of calculation, that made him the kind of man that children and animals trusted instinctively, which was sometimes an inconvenient quality in his line of work, and sometimes the most useful one possible. The mood at the table was not good. The club was carrying 2 problems simultaneously, which was one more than Colt preferred at any given time. The first problem was territorial. The Copperheads, a rising outfit operating out of Bullhead City, dealing in methamphetamine and stolen components, had been pressing at the edges of the club's recognized territory for 8 months. Not openly, not in any way that created clean cause for response. Strategically, which was worse. Small insults, minor incursions. The kind of provocation designed to accumulate pressure without providing justification. The second problem was federal. There was a grand jury. The details were not something to be discussed in a room with a jukebox and a bartender who had not been thoroughly vetted for the purpose. But the weight of it sat at the table as surely as the men themselves, a lowering of something in the air that everyone felt and no one named. Colt was working through both problems the way he worked through most problems, methodically, without rushing, turning each piece over until he could see its edges clearly. He had learned that patience was the most undervalued quality in a man's life. He had been 25 years old when the United States Army shipped him to a desert that made Arizona look temperate. Kuwait, 1990. He had come home in 1991, thinner than he had left, quieter in ways that did not resolve. He had come home to no parade, no ceremony, to a country that had processed the war as a television event and moved on. He had come home to his mother, Dolores Decker, who had been waiting alone in a Greyhound terminal in Flagstaff, with her hands folded in her lap, and who had stood when she saw him and said nothing, just put her arms around him and held on with a strength that surprised him, that always surprised him regardless of how many times he witnessed it. He had joined the club in 1993. He had joined because he was 28 years old and had been back from the Gulf for 2 years, and the civilian world felt like a language he had once spoken fluently and no longer trusted. He had joined because the men in it were men. He understood men who had arranged their lives around loyalty as a non-negotiable principle, around the idea that your word was the most fundamental currency you possessed, and that spending it carelessly was the worst kind of poverty. When he sat at a table with his back to the wall in a room full of these men, he felt for the first time since Kuwait that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He had been locked up in 2001, 7 years. He had walked out in 2008, 43 years old, and driven directly to the trailer park in Kingman, where his mother had been living for the previous decade. The door had been locked. A neighbor came out and told him. January, in her sleep, 7 months before he got out. Alone. Colt had stood on the small concrete step in front of that locked door for a long time. His hand had gone up. The knuckles approached the painted wood and then did not quite arrive. Stopped in the space between intention and action, in the inch of air between his fist and the door that he could not cross, because crossing it would have required accepting that the knock was not going to be answered. He had stood there for 20 minutes. Then he had gotten in the car and driven to the Iron Horse and had not discussed it with anyone for the better part of 2 years. On the left wrist of Colt Decker, visible below the edge of his leather cuff when it rode up, was a scar. It was old and faded, shaped roughly like a cross, the product of a piece of equipment in Kuwait in 1991 that he had grabbed without thinking. When the situation required something, grabbed immediately, and thinking was a luxury. It had healed clean. He had never given it much thought. He would later. Behind the bar, Rook, the bartender, 60 years old, with the face of a man who had heard everything and retained only what was useful, was going through the motions of wiping down the bar surface with a cloth that had seen better days. The motion was automatic, the physical equivalent of white noise. Rook had been wiping that bar with that cloth, or cloths indistinguishable from it, for 11 years. The bar was never technically clean, but Rook wiped it anyway every day without comment. There was something almost philosophical about this that Colt had never fully articulated, but had noticed. The jukebox finished its song. In the brief silence before the next one began, every small sound in the bar became briefly distinct. The rattle of the air conditioner, the slow rotation of the ceiling fans, the distant bark of a dog outside in the heat. Then the door opened. Desert light in Arizona in October at 2 in the afternoon does not enter a room politely. It arrives. It cuts through whatever preceded it with the matter-of-fact authority of something that has been burning for several billion years and does not care about the atmospheric preferences of the room it is entering. Every man at every table turned toward the door, the same instinct that turned them toward any sudden change in their environment, because in the world they occupied, sudden changes were events to be assessed before they were ignored. What they saw was not what any of them were prepared for. She was small, perhaps 5 feet tall, in the orthopedic shoes she was wearing, which were thick-soled and sensible, and entirely wrong for the establishment she had just entered. She wore a dress that was floral blue and yellow, the kind that existed in certain church-going women's wardrobes, as though time had made a private agreement to leave that particular corner of the closet alone. Her hair was white and curled close to her head. She held a red leather handbag to her chest with both hands, the knuckles of those hands visible even from across the room, white against the red, white against each other, by the grip of a person who is frightened and has decided that the frightened person is not going to be the one in charge of what happens next. In her right hand she held a wooden cane, polished smooth from use, its ferrule making contact with the hardwood floor with a sound like a knuckle against the tabletop. Clack. She took one step into the room, then another. Clack, clack. Every conversation in the Iron Horse Saloon stopped. Not gradually, not person by person, but all at once. The way conversations stop when something so fundamentally unexpected occurs that the brain requires a full moment to recategorize what it is seeing. An outsider walking uninvited into a club's home establishment was in the architecture of this world an act of aggression, or stupidity, or both. But this woman was not a rival, was not law enforcement. She was simply an elderly woman in a floral dress with a wooden cane, moving across the floor with the quiet, deliberate intention of someone who has made a decision and intends to keep making it regardless of how the room receives it. She did not look at the bar. She did not look at the pool table or the jukebox or the exit, which would have been the thing a frightened person assessed first. Her eyes, pale blue, the color of faded denim, moved across the room in a single slow sweep, bypassing the prospects near the door, bypassing Razor, bypassing Bear, and coming to rest on Colt Decker, with a directness that was either completely fearless or a very convincing imitation of it. Colt did not move. His hand rested near the edge of the table close enough to the waistband of his jeans to be informative, without being declarative. He watched her come. He let her come. He waited with the patience of a man who had learned in a desert on the other side of the world that the most important information is often contained in what a person does in the last few feet before they arrive. She stopped 2 feet from his table. She smelled of lavender soap and something older papery, the smell of documents kept in boxes for a long time. She was breathing harder than the walk across the room warranted, and her hands on the bag and the cane were still white at the knuckles, but her eyes were level and did not flinch. "Are you the president?" she asked. Her voice was thin but controlled, carrying the steadiness of something that has been rehearsed. Colt said nothing for a moment. "Then who's asking?" She took a breath that was visible, her small chest rising and falling beneath the floral fabric. "My name is Ruth. I've come a long way. My hip is hurting something terrible." She glanced just briefly at the empty wooden chair across from him. The glance said what the words had not quite said yet. She looked back at him. "Can I sit with you?" From Colt's left, Razor produced a short, involuntary sound, something between a laugh and a cough. The sound a man makes when the universe has said something so unexpected that his respiratory system responds before his judgment can intervene. Bear had stopped moving entirely. His coffee cup was suspended halfway between the table and his face forgotten. Behind the bar, Rook had stopped wiping. Every man in the room was looking at Colt Decker. You did not ask the chapter president to sit. You did not walk unannounced into the home establishment of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club and request a social engagement with the leadership. The rules of this world existed for reasons established over decades of hard experience, and this woman had walked through all of them as though they were simply not there. Colt looked at her. He looked at the cane. He looked at the dust on the thick rubber soles of her shoes. Not parking lot dust, not incidental dust, but the dust of someone who had covered real distance on foot in desert heat. He looked at the white of her knuckles and at the steadiness of her eyes, and in those eyes he saw two things simultaneously: the fear she was working very hard to manage, and underneath it, anchoring it, something he recognized because he had seen it before. He had seen it in men who had already decided they were willing to lose everything the current situation had to offer and were still standing in it anyway. He had seen it in the mirror in 2001 when he chose not to run. He reached out with his heavy boot and kicked the chair. It scraped across the floor, loud, definitive. "Sit," he said. Ruth Calloway sat down with a sound that was half relief and half physical pain, the sound of a body that has been held upright by will rather than comfort for longer than is sustainable. She rested her cane against the edge of the table and placed her red handbag directly in front of her, with both hands wrapped around it as though it were something she did not plan to release under any circumstances. "Thirsty?" Colt asked. "I would love some Earl Grey tea," Ruth said, "if it isn't too much trouble." Bear blinked. Razor looked at the ceiling. Rook appeared to be consulting something deep within himself. "We have whiskey," Bear offered carefully, "and beer. And water, but I would describe it more as ambitious than refreshing." Ruth looked briefly genuinely crestfallen. "Water will be fine, thank you." Colt looked at Rook. Rook produced a bottle of water in a glass that had been actually washed, a distinction visible to anyone who knew the history of the bar's glassware, and brought both to the table without ceremony. The room around them resumed its surface functions. Conversations restarted. Pool balls clicked in the back, but the quality of attention in the room had not diminished. It had simply gone quiet the way attention goes quiet when it is listening more carefully. "You said you came a long way," Colt said. Ruth poured water into the glass with hands that were not quite steady. "I took the Greyhound from Tucson to Kingman. Then I paid a gentleman in a pickup truck $20 to drive me to the junction." She set the bottle down. "I walked the last mile." The table was quiet, a mile in 104 degrees, on that hip, in those shoes. "Wobble," Colt said. The word contained a question that was several questions stacked inside each other, but Ruth understood which one was on top. She set her water glass down and looked at him and said, "I was told you're the man to see about getting something done. Something the regular channels won't do." "We're not a charity," Rachel said from Colt's left, with the casual authority of a man who has made this clarification before. "And we're not private investigators." "I know what you are," Ruth said. She turned her head toward Razor with a directness that made him go still, because the thing in her voice was not apology and was not deference, and was not the register you expected from a woman of 72 in a room full of these men. "I know exactly what you are." she said again. I've watched the news. I've read the reports. I know your history. I'm not here because I think you're good men. She looked back at Colt. I'm here because I need a man who can do things that good men can't. The jukebox drifted to something slower. The ceiling fans turned. Before she could continue, the door of the Iron Horse Saloon opened again. Three men came in from the heat the way men come in from bars. They've pre-selected as their next destination, with too much momentum, too much volume, and the obliviousness of those already several drinks into a day that had started too early. They were wearing high-visibility work vests over their regular clothes, still carrying the dust of whatever construction site had been their previous location. They were loud and elbowing each other with the loose camaraderie of men whose coordination is currently managed by alcohol rather than intention. They went to the bar. They ordered in the way men order when they believe volume is a form of currency. One of them, heavy-set with a neck sunburned to the color and texture of cured leather, turned on his stool and surveyed the room with the unfocused confidence of the significantly intoxicated. His gaze moved across the bikers with the studied nonchalance of someone demonstrating he was not intimidated, which is a different thing from not being intimidated. Then it landed on the table, on the bikers, on Ruth. He laughed, a wet and ugly sound. Look at that, he said to his friends, not quietly because quietly was not available to him at this moment. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. He raised his glass in a gesture meant to be sardonic. What's a nice little granny like you doing in a place like this? The bikers did not look at him. They looked at Colt. Colt did not look at the man. He was looking at Ruth. He said quietly in a voice meant only for the table, ignore him. Tell me what you need. But the man had taken the absence of response as invitation. He had mistaken patience for weakness, which is an error that men of a certain type tend to make once in their lives in situations they have not adequately read. He slid off his stool. He crossed the distance between the bar and the table with the rolling gait of the drunk and the entitled. And he put his hand on Ruth Calloway's shoulder. His fingers made contact with the floral fabric of her dress. What happened next happened in the space of approximately 2 seconds, which is a very short amount of time, and also in the arithmetic of cause and consequence, that Colt Decker had spent his life operating within entirely sufficient. Colt's left hand came off the table and closed around the man's wrist. Not with effort, with the complete and efficient authority of a man performing a motion that falls within his most practiced capabilities. He twisted the wrist backward. The angle was surgical. The sound the man's wrist joint produced was not. The man went down to his knees. The sound that came out of him was not one he would have chosen. Colt picked up the empty beer bottle from the table with his right hand and brought it down against the table edge in one clean motion. The glass broke precisely a jagged edge, a makeshift instrument of persuasion 4 inches from the kneeling man's face. The bar was silent again. A different kind of silent this time. She asked. Colt said, his voice at a volume only slightly above conversational. No anger in it. Anger would have been easier to process than the absolute settled conviction of a man who has long since passed the point where emotion needs to precede action. If she could sit with me. He looked down at the man on his knees. She didn't ask you for anything. Bear and Razor were on their feet. The two friends of the kneeling man had started forward from the bar and had stopped because the two men standing between them and the situation were Bear Malone and Razor Tully, and the geometry of this had communicated itself without words. Apologize, Colt said. I'm sorry, the man said, the words broken by his breathing. I'm sorry, dude. Not to me. The man looked up. He found Ruth's face. His own face was the face of a man who has been in the course of about 90 seconds completely restructured. I'm sorry, ma'am, he said. I am truly sorry. Colt released the wrist. The man stood slowly. Colt looked toward the door and the three men went through it, and the sound of tires in the parking lot followed shortly. The bar readjusted itself. The jukebox found another song. Colt set the broken bottle down on the table. He wiped his hand on the leg of his jeans and looked back at Ruth. Ruth Calloway had not moved, had not flinched, had not produced any of the sounds that the situation might have been expected to generate in a 72-year-old woman in a floral dress who had just watched a man be brought to his knees 18 inches from where she was sitting. She was looking at Colt with an expression he could not immediately name. Not gratitude exactly, more like recognition, as if she were looking at something she had been told about and was now confirming with her own eyes. You have his eyes, she said. The words were quiet, almost to herself, but the room was quiet enough that they carried. Colt looked at her. Whose eyes? Ruth Calloway set her red leather handbag on the table, unclasped it with hands steadier now, than when she had arrived and reached inside. What she produced was an object wrapped in a square of silk cream colored old enough that the edges had begun to fray. She unwrapped it carefully, the way people unwrap things that have been wrapped a long time, with a deliberateness that said, "This has been wrapped since before you can remember." And the unwrapping is its own kind of ceremony. Inside the silk was a photograph, a Polaroid. The image had drifted over 40 years toward the amber and sepia that old color photographs migrate toward, a fading from the world of true color into something warmer and more distant, a visual version of the way memory softens edges without losing substance. The photograph showed a young man. He was leaning against a motorcycle with the casual ownership of someone who knows that the machine and himself are a single image, inseparable. He was perhaps 24 years old, lean with long hair lighter than it appeared in the faded print, and he was grinning with the recklessness that belongs to young men who have not yet met the consequence that will eventually redefine them. He was not wearing a club cut, but his posture had a quality that every man at the table recognized, the stance of someone who lives on two wheels by preference and conviction rather than circumstance. The motorcycle he was leaning against was extraordinary. Even in the faded Polaroid, even at 40 years remove, it was visibly extraordinary. A 1958 panhead with a rigid frame and high-rise handlebars, and a fishtail exhaust that curved out and back with the elegance of something designed by someone who understood that function and beauty are not always in opposition. The paint on the tank was a deep blue, midnight blue, the kind that absorbs light rather than reflecting it, with a lightning bolt along the flank in silver. Ruth slid the photograph across the table. Colt picked it up. Razor and Bear leaned in. "That's my husband," Ruth said. Her voice was softer now, not weaker, softer. The difference between a blade sheathed and a blade drawn. His name was Jack. Everyone called him Ghost. Colt studied the photograph. He did not recognize the young man, but the motorcycle he recognized in the way that men who love machines recognize exceptional ones immediately, intuitively, with a certainty that doesn't require examination. "That's a panhead," Bear said somewhat unnecessarily. 1958, Ruth confirmed. "He customized it himself. There isn't another one like it." "I don't know him," Colt said. "You wouldn't. He died in 1974. She said it the way people say things they have been saying for a long time, not without feeling, but with the economy of grief that has been carried so long it has learned to travel light. Before you were old enough to know him, maybe before you were born." "So what do you want from me?" Colt said. "If he's gone—" "The bike isn't gone," Ruth said. Something shifted in her voice on those four words. Something tightened, became more specific, more present, more alive than the controlled steadiness she had maintained from the parking lot to this chair. "The bike isn't gone," she said again. "And neither is what Jack hid inside the tank before he died." She reached into the handbag again and produced a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it on the table and smoothed the crease with one finger. It was a printout of a Craigslist listing, 3 days old. At the top, the image was grainy, the resolution of a photograph taken quickly in poor light. But within the grain, visible to anyone who had spent 30 seconds looking at the photograph in Colt's hand, a gas tank. Midnight blue. A silver lightning bolt partially obscured by decades of dust and grime and weather, but present. Unmistakably present. For sale, 1958, Harley-Davidson Panhead Restoration Project, barn find no title, $4,500. Bullhead City, Arizona. Colt looked at the listing. He looked at the photograph. He set them both next to each other on the table and looked at the woman across from him. "You want me to buy it?" he said. "I have the money to buy it," Ruth said. She patted the red bag. "I spent the last 2 months pulling together what I could. But the man selling it—" She paused. "When I called him, he sounded like someone I wouldn't want to meet alone. And I'm an old woman with cash in her purse." She looked down at her hands briefly, then back up. "I need protection, and I need someone who knows motorcycles well enough to confirm that it's really his." "And the money inside the tank?" Razor asked, his voice carefully neutral. Ruth looked at him. "Jack was a courier. Not for any club. For a group that rish out of Nevada back then, called themselves the Satan's Riders. You've heard of them." A look passed between Colt and Razor. The Satan's Riders had been a significant operation through the late 60s and 70s, absorbed or eliminated in the early 80s in the way that organizations built on violence and without discipline tend to terminate. "I know who they were," Colt said. "Jack stole from them," Ruth said. She did not look away when she said it. "He wasn't a bad man. He was desperate. I was pregnant. We had nothing. He took a package he wasn't supposed to take, and he converted it, and he hid $50,000 in cash inside a false bottom he welded into that gas tank. She touched the photograph. He was going to come back for us. Come back for the money. Start us somewhere new. But he didn't make it back, Colt said. They found him. Ran him off the road outside Flagstaff. He died at the scene. She said it evenly. The evenness cost her something, but she paid it. The bike was impounded. I never saw it again. I never saw the money. My son, she stopped, just briefly. My son was taken by the state because I couldn't afford to keep him. I spent the next 40 years being a librarian in Tucson. She placed both hands flat on the table on either side of the red bag and looked at Colt Decker. That money was meant for my family. I have a grandson now. His name is Owen. He's 24 years old. His father was barely 17 when Owen was born, a boy raised in the state system trying to raise a child of his own, which is the mathematics of poverty, how it compounds across generations until someone finds the means to interrupt it. Owen works at a scrapyard and has never once in his life had anything handed to him that wasn't already broken. I want to find that money. I want to give it to him. It's the only thing Jack ever left us. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a sentence has been said that requires a moment to settle before anything else can occupy the same space. Bullhead City is Copperhead territory. Razor's voice was low, directed at Colt rather than the table generally. The subtext was not subtle. The Copperheads were already a problem. Riding into their territory in force would read as escalation. Colt did not answer. He was still looking at Ruth. He was thinking about the dust on the soles of her shoes. About a mile walked in 104 degrees on a bad hip. About the phone call she had made to a man in Bullhead City who had sounded over the phone like someone she wouldn't want to meet alone, and about the fact that she had made the call and then gotten on a Greyhound bus to Kingman anyway. He was thinking about his mother standing alone in a Greyhound terminal in Flagstaff in 1991. He was thinking about a door he had never been able to knock on. He stood up from the table. The chair behind him made a sound against the floor. Razor, Bear. His voice settled the room without elevation. Get the keys. Razor looked at him. We bringing the crew? No. Colt picked up his helmet from the bench beside him. Just us. We're taking a ride. He looked down at Ruth Calloway and extended his right hand toward her large scarred oil, darkened the hand of a man who had built and broken things in equal measure across 48 years of living. She reached up and took it. And that was when he saw it. He had been in the process of helping her to her feet, and her sleeve, the lace at the wrist of the floral dress, had ridden up by perhaps an inch and a half as her arm extended. In the gap between the lace and the cuff of his hand on the inside of her wrist, there was a tattoo. It was old. The ink had spread and softened over the decades the way old tattoos do. The lines blurred, the definition gone. The original precision dissolved into something gentler and more ambiguous. But the shape of it was still legible to anyone who knew what to look for. 2 numerals, inked side by side. 1. In the world Colt Decker occupied, those 2 numbers corresponded to 2 letters of the alphabet. The 8th letter, the first letter. H.A. Colt's grip on her hand did not release. But it tightened. Ruth did not pull away. She met his eyes and held them, and in the space of 1 second, the length of a breath, the quality of her gaze changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that another person might have caught, but to Colt Decker, who had spent his life reading the difference between what people showed and what they were, the change was as clear as a door opening. The grandmother was still there, but behind her, older than her, steadier than her, with roots that went somewhere very different, was someone else entirely. Is there something you're not telling me? Colt said. His voice had not risen. It had gone in the opposite direction, quieter, more precise, the voice of a man narrowing his attention to a single point. Ruth Calloway looked up at him. The pale blue eyes were clear in the way that comes not from innocence, but from having passed through a great deal and come out the other side with nothing left to protect except the things she had come here for. And she smiled. Not the nervous, apologetic smile she had offered Razor when she asked for Earl Grey tea. Not the grateful smile of someone given a chair when she needed one. It was a different smile altogether, the smile of a woman who has been carrying a very large and very carefully wrapped secret for a very long time and has finally found the room she was willing to open it in. I told you I need a certain kind of man, Colt, she said. Drive, I'll tell you the rest on the way. He looked at her for a long moment, then he walked her to the door. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western edge of the desert, pulling the shadows long across the asphalt, turning the dust in the air from white to gold. The Harleys were waiting in the lot. The old Ford cargo van, black dented with a suspension that had opinions about every road surface it crossed, was parked at the far end. Bear climbed into the driver's seat. Razor checked the left saddlebag of his bike with the methodical efficiency of a man confirming what he already knows is there. Colt stood at the passenger side of the van and opened the door and waited. Ruth Calloway took the step up into the passenger seat with the careful deliberateness of a body managing itself around something that hurts. Settled in, arranged her bag in her lap, and looked out through the windshield at the desert highway stretching west toward Bullhead City. Colt closed the door, walked to his own bike, pulled his helmet on the chin strap, clicking into place with the finality of a decision made. The engine turned over with a sound like something very large and very certain waking up. And somewhere on the inside of a 72-year-old woman's wrist, beneath the lace cuff of a floral dress, two faded numbers rode into the Arizona afternoon, carrying 40 years of everything they meant. The desert opened ahead of them. There were things Colt Decker did not yet know. He did not know what was in the gas tank of a 1958 Panhead in a junkyard in Bullhead City, besides the money Ruth had described. He did not know the name of the man selling that motorcycle, or whose son he was, or what that parentage meant for the shape the afternoon was about to take. He did not know how Ruth's story connected to the territorial crisis the club was currently managing, or that the connection, when it became visible, would change the legal landscape of the Mojave chapter so fundamentally that the men involved would speak of it for the rest of their lives as a before and after line. He did not know any of that yet. What he knew was this: a woman who smelled of lavender soap had walked a mile through 104 degrees of Arizona heat on a hip that hurt her, with a red leather handbag and a 40-year-old photograph, and a story that required a certain kind of man to finish. And on the inside of her wrist, in ink that had blurred and softened, but had not in 40-plus years disappeared, were two numbers that told him she had known, for longer than he had been alive, exactly what kind of man she was looking for. The bike moved onto the highway. Route 66 stretched ahead. Whatever came next was coming. Part 2. Bullhead City Blues. The road west out of Kingman on Highway 68 runs through a landscape that does not apologize for itself. There are no trees to speak of, no water visible from the road. The earth on either side is the color of old bone, broken occasionally by the dark geometry of volcanic rock, and the vertical green of cactus that has learned to store everything it needs inside itself because the environment it lives in will not provide it. The mountains in the distance shift from purple to rust to darkened gold, depending on where the sun sits in its arc, and they wait at the horizon with the patience of things that have watched everything else come and go. It is a landscape that rewards a certain kind of person, the kind who does not need the world to be soft in order to find it beautiful. The two Harleys ran point ahead of the van, their engines a combined sound that the desert absorbed and returned in a slightly different register, taking the thing in and giving it back changed, made part of the general frequency of a place that has its own ongoing conversation with itself, that has nothing to do with the people passing through it. Inside the van, Bear Malone drove with both hands on the wheel and the window cracked 2 inches. The air conditioning had been inoperative for 14 months. This was a fact Bear had been meaning to address and had not addressed, a pattern that described his relationship to most mechanical problems in his personal life, extraordinary at fixing things for other people, and indifferent to the same things in his own orbit, as though the motivation required a beneficiary other than himself. Ruth Calloway sat in the passenger seat with her red bag on her lap and her cane resting between her knees, watching the road through the windshield with an expression that was not the expression of a woman simply passing through scenery. It was the expression of a woman traveling towards something that had been unfinished for a very long time, measuring the distance left in units she did not share with the other occupant of the cab. Bear drove in silence for 11 miles. This was for Bear a sustained and unusual silence. He was the kind of man who filled quiet space the way a large object fills a room, not aggressively, not consciously, but inevitably as a function of his nature. He lasted 11 miles. This was by his standards significant restraint. "So," he said. Ruth looked at him briefly, then back at the road. "So," she agreed. "You really walked a mile in that heat," Bear said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It occupied the grammatical space between the two that people use when they want to express something they haven't fully formed yet. "My bus got in at 11:30, Ruth said. "The man in the pickup truck could only take me as far as the junction." "That junction is 1.25 miles from the saloon," Bear said. "Yes," Ruth said. Bear was quiet for another quarter mile. "That's a long way," he said finally. "On a bad hip." It's a longer way, Ruth said not unkindly, to have come from and done nothing when you got there. Bear thought about this for a while with the full and unhurried attention he gave to things that seemed worth thinking about properly. Then he nodded once with the complete physical conviction of a large man who has arrived at a conclusion he intends to keep. Outside, Colt's Harley ran ahead of the van by 30 yards, the sound of its engine carrying back as a constant low presence. Razor rode off Colt's left shoulder, the two machines moving in the unconscious synchrony of men who have ridden together long enough that the coordination has become conversational. On the bike, Colt Decker was alone with the road and the engine, and the thinking that comes when a man is moving at speed through open country with his hands occupied and his mind left to its own navigation. He was thinking about the tattoo. Not the fact of it, he had processed the fact of it back in the parking lot, filed it in the mental location he used for things that required attention, but not yet response. He was thinking about the age of it, about how far the ink lines had migrated from their original precision. That tattoo had been there for decades. The woman had been carrying it since before Colt Decker was the man he currently was, possibly since before he was a man at all. And she had covered it, every day, under the lace cuff of dresses like the one she was wearing. In a library in Tucson, behind a reference desk, processing returns and answering questions, and moving through a life that looked from every visible angle like the life of a woman named Ruth, who had nothing to do with the world that the tattoo on her wrist signified. 40 years of that. He thought about what it costs a person to put down the thing they are and become the thing they need to be in order to survive. He had been 25 years old when he came home from Kuwait, and the man who came home was not identical to the man who had left. Not damaged, changed. Changed in ways that the people around him could see and could not name and did not know how to respond to, because the specific change that combat makes in a person is not visible in any individual interaction, but is present in all of them, like a frequency that runs beneath every conversation you have for the rest of your life, audible only to people who are running the same frequency themselves. He had been 28 when he joined the club, and the relief of it was the relief of a man who had found, for the first time since coming home, a room where the frequency did not need to be explained, where it was simply understood because the other men in the room were running versions of it themselves sourced from their own accumulated histories, their own before and afters. Brotherhood, he had come to understand across the 15 years since then, is not found. It is built. It is built in the specific increments of showing up, of keeping your word, of being present when being present costs something, of being the people who do not let a person walk out of a room alone if the room understands what walking out alone means. He had not understood that in 1993 when he joined. He was beginning to understand something else now. Watching the back of Ruth Calloway's white-curled head through the windshield of the van rolling west on Highway 68, thinking about a woman who had walked a mile in 104 degrees alone because she had no one to walk it with her, because she had spent 40 years being invisible by necessity and was now with 2 months left in her account done with the necessity. The road curved southwest. In the distance, the Colorado River was a line of silver between the brown banks and beyond it the Nevada border. In the cluster of low buildings that was Bullhead City beginning to resolve out of the desert haze on the right side of the highway. Colt signaled. Both bikes decelerated. The van followed onto the shoulder. 5 miles outside Bullhead City, the engines idled and ticked, the metal cooling and contracting in a series of small sounds. Colt got off his bike and walked to the van. He pulled the passenger door open. Ruth looked down at him from the height of the cab. Her hands were on the bag. Her face was composed in the way that suggested the composure was a practice rather than a natural state. "Before we go in," Colt said. His voice was flat and direct, the voice he used when information exchange needed to be exact. "You tell me the rest of it. Right now, all of it." Ruth held his eyes for a moment. Then she pushed her sleeve up. The 81 was visible in the afternoon light, clearer than it had been in the dim of the saloon. He looked at it. Then she rotated her arm slightly, showing the underside of the wrist, where a second tattoo sat close to the skin, smaller, older, the ink so faded it was barely a shadow. 3 letters, AFF, Angel Forever Forever, and beneath it 4 smaller letters that he had to lean in to read. He read them. He stood back up to his full height. His expression did not change on the surface. Beneath the surface, something very specific was happening to his understanding of the afternoon. "Your maiden name," he said. "Barger," Ruth said. "Distant, by blood, not by name, but blood." He looked at her. "Jack wasn't stealing from the Satan's riders because he was desperate," she said. "He was taking their money because they owed it." They owed it to the club. He was sent to Kingman in the spring of 1974 to establish the charter. He had the founding documents. He had the territory maps. He had 6 men ready to sign. He was also carrying operational money because the money was moving through their routes and the club had use for it, and Jack was the man assigned to bring it in. She said it evenly, as if reading from a document she had memorized long ago and reviewed many times since. The Satan's writers found out. They had someone inside. They knew what he was carrying, and they knew what it meant if the charter got established, because a sanctioned Hells Angels charter in Kingman changes the territorial map in ways that cost them operationally. So they contracted with a corrupt county deputy named Frank Pruitt, and Frank Pruitt ran Jack's bike off the road on a Thursday night in October 1974, and Jack died on the shoulder of Route 40 with the founding documents and the money both sealed inside the gas tank of that panhead. The bike was impounded. Frank Pruitt kept it. She stopped. She took a breath. The charter never got filed. The territory never got established on record. And for 40 years, the Hells Angels Kingman chapter has been operating on ground that in the eyes of the national organization has never been formally sanctioned, which means that anyone pressing on your borders has a legal argument by club law that you haven't met the threshold for territorial claim. The silence that followed was the silence of a man rereading a document he thought he understood and finding a sentence he had missed. Razor had walked up behind Colt and was standing close enough to hear. He said nothing. His face was the face of someone doing rapid arithmetic and not liking where the numbers were pointing. If the founding documents are in that tank, Colt said. They are. And they established the 1974 charter. Jack's signature is on them. 6 others, the territory maps. The national officers of the time countersigned them before Jack left for Kingman. She looked at him. Your territorial dispute with the Copperheads is not just a street problem. They know what you don't have on paper. Someone told them. And they've been testing your perimeter for 8 months because they believe that when it comes to a formal claim before the National Council, they can make a case that you don't have sanctioned ground. Colt stood in the heat and the dust of the highway shoulder and understood in the comprehensive way that a man understands things when the full shape of them becomes visible all at once, that she had not come to the Iron Horse Saloon today with a problem. She had come with a solution. She had come carrying in a silk-wrapped Polaroid and a Craigslist printout, the instrument required to resolve a conflict that the club had been fighting without its most important weapon, because the most important weapon had been locked inside a gas tank in a junkyard in Bullhead City for 40 years. Why wait 40 years, he said. It was the most important question. Ruth set her jaw. For a moment, she looked past him, past Razor, past the bikes on the shoulder, out toward the distant line of the river. Because I had a child, she said. Because if I claimed Jack's patch, they would have killed me and taken the boy. So I became Ruth the librarian. I became invisible. She looked back at him, and the fire in those pale blue eyes was not the fire of desperation, but of someone who has taken careful inventory of what they have left and has decided to spend every bit of it. Because I have cancer, Colt, 2 months, and I decided I was done being invisible. Colt stood with that for a long moment. Then he looked at Razor. Razor looked back with the expression of a man who has just revised his understanding of every hour of the current day from the beginning. Get back in the van, Colt said to Ruth. He said it with a gentleness that was not a departure from his character, but an accurate expression of one of its less frequently visible dimensions. He walked back to his bike. He put his helmet on. He sat for a moment on the idling machine, with both boots on the ground and his hands on the handlebars, and let the engine's vibration move through him, organizing something, settling something, the mechanical equivalent of a deep breath. Then he put the bike in gear, and the convoy moved back onto the highway, and Bullhead City came toward them out of the desert heat. Pruitt Auto and Salvage occupied a lot on the eastern edge of Bullhead City that looked from the road like the aftermath of an explosion in a particularly diverse warehouse. Shipping containers stacked too high formed the outer perimeter, their paint faded and rust-streaked. Inside the perimeter, the shapes of vehicles in various states of disassembly rose and fell like a metal landscape with its own geography. A chain-link gate padlock closed the main entrance. A hand-painted sign read Pruitt Auto and Salvage. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. Below that, in different paint applied at a different time, survivors will be prosecuted again. Colt and Razor brought their bikes to a stop in front of the gate. The van pulled up behind them and idled. The engines brought from somewhere inside the compound the response of 2 large dogs on chains, their voices carrying the urgency of animals whose primary function is to announce and whose secondary function is to mean it. After perhaps 40 seconds, a man emerged from a corrugated metal structure set back from the gate. He was walking the unhurried walk of someone who controls the gate and therefore controls the tempo of the interaction, a deliberate pace that communicated awareness of the visitors and indifference to their timeline. He was approximately 50 years old. His head was shaved clean, and the skin of it was the dark, uneven tan of a man who worked outdoors without concern for what the sun did to him. He had tattoos on his neck, or a spider web, that climbed from below his collar to behind his left ear with the patient geometric elaboration of someone who had made a series of related decisions over a long period of time. He wore the straps of denim overalls over a bare torso that showed the build of a man who had once been significantly more muscular and had maintained most of it. In his right hand, he carried a long-handled wrench with the casual carry of a man for whom a tool in the hand is simply a natural state of being. This was Dale Pruitt. He reached the gate and looked at them through the chain link with the evaluating expression of a man adding numbers he has seen before. His eyes moved over the patches on Colt's vest with the attention of someone reading a language he knows. "We're closed," he said. "Heard about the panhead," Colt said. "Duana." "The Craigslist listing." Something shifted in Pruitt's face. Not the shift of a man's surprise, the shift of a man who has been waiting for a particular visitor and is now adjusting from anticipation to performance. He wiped his free hand on the thigh of his overalls. "Didn't know the angels were into restoration," he said. His voice carried a quality not quite mockery, not quite respect, occupying the space between them that a man uses when he wants to keep his options open. "Thought you boys only rode the new glides." "Open the gate," Colt said. "We've got cash." Pruitt looked at the gate, looked at Colt, looked at the way, and spent slightly more time on it than the situation strictly required. Then he reached for the padlock, the key already in his hand, Colt noted already out, before the request was made, and worked the lock open and dragged the gate sideways along its track, just far enough for the vehicles to pass. "Bike's in the back structure," Pruitt said, falling into step beside the van as it rolled through. "Got a call an hour ago from a man offering $5,000. You want it, you're going to need to beat it." "Let's see it first," Razor said. Pruitt led them through the compound on a path that wound between the containers and the stacked car bodies and the various mechanical remains of vehicles that had reached the end of their useful lives. The ground was compacted dirt and gravel, oily near the drainage channels that ran between the rows of junk. The smell was complex petroleum and rust, and the dry animal smell of the dogs who tracked the visitors' passage with sustained vocal commentary from their respective chains. The structure at the back of the compound was larger than it had appeared from the gate, a corrugated metal shed perhaps 60 feet wide and 40 deep open at the front, its interior in the organized chaos that is not chaos at all to the person who organized it, but reads as chaos to everyone else. Along the walls, shelves held sorted components, carburetors, brake assemblies, gauges, and instruments, chrome trim pieces in various states of restoration. The floor was concrete stained dark in overlapping patterns by decades of oil and solvent in the chemistry of mechanical work. At the center of the shed, beneath a tarpaulin that had once been green and had weathered to a kind of indeterminate gray-green, was a shape. Pruitt grabbed the edge of the tarpaulin and pulled it free in a single motion. The motorcycle beneath it was not beautiful in the way that restored machines are beautiful. It was beautiful the way survivors are beautiful, marked by everything it had endured, carrying the visible record of its history without apology. The tires were flat, the rubber cracked from decades of sitting. The chrome on the exhaust pipes was obscured by rust that had formed on top of oxidation, that had formed on top of earlier rust. The biology of neglect laid down in strata. The leather of the seat had been systematically destroyed by years of weather and rodents who had found it suitable material for their purposes. The kickstand was seized at an awkward angle. But the tank was midnight blue. Even through the grime decades of it, the accumulated sediment of time and storage, and the indignities of being kept as a trophy in a place like this, the color was there. It had not disappeared. It had not faded to something generic or gray. Beneath the film of dust and oil and neglect, the blue was still itself, still that depth, that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, still that shade that at certain angles seemed to have something moving inside it. And along the flank of the tank, barely visible, present in the ghost image way that things reveal themselves when you know to look for them, the silver lightning bolt. Colt crouched down in front of the bike. He ran his right hand along the lower frame, feeling the welds, reading the machine through his fingertips, the way men who have spent their lives with motorcycles learn to read them through contact, through the language of metal and construction, and the record that time leaves in both. He straightened up. He reached out and placed his palm flat against the side of the tank. He tapped the bottom of it with two knuckles. The sound that came back was not the sound of a hollow tank. It had more density to it, a sound with something behind it. A false bottom welded in place with a cavity between the original floor of the tank and the false one sealed for 40 years. Colt stood up. $5 grand, Pruitt said from behind him. Cash. Take it as is, no title, no paperwork. Colt reached into the inside pocket of his vest, and then from the entrance of the shed, a voice. It's not for sale. Every man in the shed turned. Ruth Calloway was standing in the entrance of the corrugated metal structure. She had gotten out of the van, had made her way through the compound on her bad hip, past the stacked containers and the chained dogs on the uneven gravel and compacted dirt without assistance, without announcement. Bear was directly behind her with the expression of a man who had tried to prevent something and had been overruled by a force he had not adequately anticipated. She walked into the shed. Her cane made its sound on the concrete floor, clack, 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 and the shed's metal walls returned the sound in a slight echo that gave each step a doubled quality, as if there were two of her. She walked to the motorcycle and stopped in front of it. She reached out her right hand, the one not holding the cane, and touched the headlight with the pads of two fingers. She held the contact for a moment with her eyes closed. When she opened them, she turned to Dale Pruitt. She looked at him the way she had looked at Colt Decker in the Iron Horse Saloon, directly without the protective ambiguity that people use when they want to leave themselves room to retreat. I know this bike, she said. I know where you got it, and I know who your father was. Pruitt's expression did not change immediately. The change came in increments, a slight tightening around the eyes, a reset of the jaw, a recalibration of the posture from commercial negotiation to something more guarded and more alert. I got this bike from an estate sale in Flagstaff, he said. His voice had shed the casual quality it had carried through the gate and across the compound. What was left beneath it was harder and less willing. You got it from the impound lot auction in 1975, Ruth said. Your father was Deputy Frank Pruitt of the Mojave County Sheriff's Office. He ran my husband off the road on the night of October 17, 1974, on the payroll of a criminal organization called the Satan's Riders. My husband died at the scene. Deputy Pruitt impounded the motorcycle and kept it for himself as a personal souvenir of the event. And when he died, you inherited it along with everything else. The shed had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. Pruitt was still. The knuckles of his right hand, which still held the wrench, had changed their color. He was looking at Ruth with an expression that had moved past guardedness into something more complex, something that had history in it, something that recognized the shape of a conversation it had perhaps been waiting for in one form or another for a long time. You got a big mouth for a woman in a place like this, he said. I've been told, Ruth said. She did not move. She did not adjust her position or her grip on the cane or the level of her gaze. She stood in front of the motorcycle her husband had built and ridden and died on inside which he had hidden the evidence of everything he had been trying to do, and she looked at Dale Pruitt with the eyes of a woman who has spent 40 years arriving at this moment and is not going to spend a single additional second pretending she is somewhere else. My daddy kept that bike in the garage, Pruitt said. The hardness in his voice had shifted into something different, something that had been preserved in the specific storage unit where men keep the things they repeat to themselves because the repeating has become structural. He brought it home the night he came home from that job. Used to take me out there on Sundays when I was a kid. Said it was the finest machine he'd ever put hands on. A pause, something moved across his face that was not grief, but was adjacent to it in the way that all things inherited from parents are adjacent to their actual feelings without being identical to them. Said the man who wrote it screamed like a child when the car hit him. The shed absorbed the sentence, returned nothing useful. Colt saw Ruth flinch. It was small, a single involuntary movement at the left corner of her mouth, a compression of something she immediately controlled. But it was there, and that was sufficient. The price just went down, Colt said. His voice was the voice of a man making a factual correction. To zero, he said. Pruitt laughed the laugh of a man who has assessed the room and believes he has read it correctly. You think you can walk out of here with... He put two fingers to his lips. The whistle carried through the back wall of the shed. From behind the shelving units on the left wall, from around the rear corner of the structure, from between the gap in the containers, visible through the open front of the shed, shadows became men. They came in the unhurried way of people who have been waiting in position and are now simply completing the motion they began when they took up their places. 7 of them. They wore the colors of the Copperheads, rising out of Bullhead City, operating primarily in methamphetamine distribution and vehicle theft, without the organizational structure or long institutional history of the club, but with the dangerous energy of an organization in its aggressive expansion phase when the cost-benefit calculation of violence still runs in favor of violence more often than it eventually will. They carried tire irons lengths of chain, a section of rebar. The man who had come around the right side of the shed was carrying a sawn-off shotgun, with the barrel resting in his left palm and the stock in his right hand held low but held with the casual competence of someone for whom the weapon is not a dramatic prop but an operational tool. "Called my boys when I saw the patches coming down the road," Pruitt said. The commercial negotiation register was fully gone. What had replaced it was the voice of a man on familiar ground in a situation whose geometry he believed he controls. "We don't appreciate your kind in Bullhead City, and we definitely don't appreciate you coming for things that belong to us." 3 against 8. Bear was behind Ruth. Razor was to Colt's left. The man with the shotgun was between them and the exit at an angle that covered both the direct route out and the diagonal. Colt assessed this without visible motion, the way he had been assessing the geometry of difficult spaces since 1990, when a man named Sergeant Willard Ash had spent 6 weeks teaching 25-year-old Colt Decker that the first skill in any adverse situation is not the skill of fighting, but the skill of reading. Reading the room, reading the positions, reading who is committed and who is performing, reading where the exits are and which of them are real. He read the room. "Ruth," he said, his voice entirely level, "get behind Bear." Ruth did not move. "Ruth," he said again with slightly more specificity. "I heard you, Colt," Ruth said. Her right hand moved from the cane to the red leather handbag. The men in the shed watched her hand go into the bag. They watched because you watch a person's hands, the most basic of instincts, the most primary of all readings, and what they expected to see come out of the bag of a 72-year-old woman in a floral dress was a phone perhaps, or some other desperate gesture toward a technology that would not help her in a corrugated metal shed on the wrong side of a junkyard in Bullhead City. What came out was a revolver, a Smith & Wesson Model 36.38 special with a 2-inch barrel, the snub-nose configuration that had been standard issue for plainclothes officers for decades and had spread across American households with the quiet ubiquity of a thing that is useful and not large and easy to put in a drawer and not think about for years at a time. The finish on this one was worn nearly to bare metal at the contact points. The barrel, the cylinder release, the backstrap, the wear pattern of a gun that had been handled regularly for a very long time and had not been babied. The wood grip panels were dark with age and use. She raised it with both hands, the left supporting the right at the wrist, a grip that was not improvised, not the panicked grip of someone discovering they are holding a firearm in an emergency, but a practiced grip, a grip with memory in it. She pointed it at a spot approximately 6 inches in front of Dale Pruitt's right boot. She pulled the trigger. In a corrugated metal shed with walls that amplify, rather than absorb a point, .38 Special does not sound like a gunshot. It sounds like the shed itself has been struck by something enormous. The sound fills every cubic foot of the space simultaneously and then bounces back from all 4 walls and the ceiling in a compressed cacophony that arrives in the inner ear as something close to physical pressure. The bullet struck the concrete floor 6 inches in front of Pruitt's boot and threw a chip of concrete against his shin. Pruitt stumbled back 1 step. His face had reorganized itself completely. The 7 copperheads froze, not the theatrical freeze of people performing surprise, but the genuine freeze of people whose brains have briefly outpaced their bodies because what they were seeing did not match what they had prepared for. "The next one," Ruth said into the ringing silence that followed the shot, her voice carrying clearly, despite its thinness, because the shed was now completely comprehensively quiet, "goes into your kneecap." She moved the barrel a few degrees to center on Pruitt's right leg. "Tell your men to put down what they're carrying, all of it, on the floor." She was shaking. Both hands on the grip of the revolver were shaking with a fine, high-frequency tremor that was not the tremor of fear and was not the tremor of age and was not anything that required comfort or response. It was the tremor of controlled fury of anger that has been waiting 40 years for a room in which to be expressed and is now expressing itself through the only channel currently available. "I'm not shaking because I'm scared," Ruth said. "I want to be clear about that." The split second that followed was the split second Colt Decker had been waiting for. He moved. He covered the distance between himself and the man with the shotgun in the time it takes to cover distance when you have already decided before the movement begins exactly what the movement will accomplish. His shoulder connected with the man's solar plexus with the full transferred mass of a 230-pound man in committed forward motion, and the man folded. The shotgun left his hands. It hit the concrete and did not discharge because the safety was on which Colt had assessed and noted 30 seconds earlier. Razor was already moving. He had grabbed a truck wheel rim from the shelf to his left, heavy 2 feet across, the kind of object that, when swung with commitment by a lean 45-year-old man who has spent his life in situations that reward the creative application of available materials, functions adequately as a substitute for more conventional instruments of conflict. He swung it. The man to his right went down. Bear Malone had one job. He was not unaware of the fight happening to his left and behind him. He was simply not doing the fight. He had his hands on the handlebars of the 1958 Panhead and his feet planted in his considerable mass in motion, and he was moving the motorcycle toward the entrance of the shed with the focused determination of a man who has been given a single clear directive by someone he respects and intends to complete it, regardless of the accompanying environmental conditions. The tires were flat, the frame was heavy, the kickstand was seized at an angle that complicated the geometry of the roll. None of these things stopped Bear Malone. They complicated him. He addressed each complication as it arose in sequence, with the problem-solving methodology of a man who does not have the option of stopping. Dale Pruitt had recovered enough to find a crowbar on the workbench behind him and raise it with the intention of a man who has fixed on a target and is moving toward it. The target was the back of Colt's head. "Colt!" Ruth's voice cut through the noise of the shed with the clarity of something aimed. "Left." Colt dropped. The crowbar passed through the air where the back of his head had been a fraction of a second earlier, the displaced air moving over his ducked head with the near-miss quality that a man never entirely stops feeling in the base of his spine long after the moment has passed. He came back up rotating and drove his right fist into Pruitt's kidney with the compact, economical force of a short punch delivered with full body weight behind it. Pruitt went to one knee. From outside the shed, the sound of breaking glass. Then a second breaking sound. Then a smell, the sharp chemical bloom of accelerant, and behind it the particular orange quality of light that means fire has begun. "They're burning us out," Razor's voice from somewhere behind Colt. "Boss, we need to go." Bear had the panhead at the entrance of the shed. 3 of the copperheads who had not been immediately addressed were attempting to close the distance. Bear set the motorcycle carefully against the wall at an angle that would allow him to return to it, turned around and addressed the 3 men with the uncomplicated directness of his full physical capacity. Bear Malone was 42 years old, 300 pounds, and had a functional theory of close-quarters conflict that was not complex but was comprehensive. Make contact with as much of yourself as possible at the highest velocity available, and maintain commitment through the duration of the motion. He applied this theory to the first of the 3 men. The result was immediate and decisive. The other 2 reconsidered their approach. Colt grabbed Ruth by the waist. She was still holding the revolver. She did not resist being moved. She had read the room the same way he had and understood that the time for the revolver had passed and the time for the exit had arrived. He moved her through the shed entrance past the panhead into the compound where the first Molotov cocktail had set the frame of the shed entrance beginning to catch. "Van," he said. They moved through the compound at the pace determined by Ruth's hip and the fact that the gravel between the shed and the gate was not accommodating of urgency on a compromised joint. Colt matched her pace with his hand at her back, not lifting her, not carrying her, simply being present as a counterforce to what wanted to tip her, which was enough. Bear had returned to the panhead. He had it at the van's rear doors. The doors were open. Colt had pulled them on the way past. Bear lifted the rear wheel of the panhead with both hands, and a sound from the base of his chest that was not a word and was not a grunt, but occupied a register between them, the sound of a man producing more than he normally has available. He manhandled the machine up the angle of the van floor with its flat tires dragging and its frame screeching against the metal until the rear wheel cleared the bumper, then the frame, then the front wheel. The bike was fully loaded, the van's suspension compressed under the combined weight. Razor came through the shed entrance at a run. Behind him, the structure was fully involved now, the corrugated metal walls conducting heat, the interior light through the entrance doorway, orange and flickering the smoke, beginning its lateral spread across the compound. Dale Pruitt was in the entrance of the shed. He was holding the crowbar. He threw it. The trajectory was long and the accuracy was poor, and it landed 6 feet behind Razor in the gravel, a dull and harmless report. Colt got Ruth into the passenger seat of the van. He closed the door. Bear dropped into the driver's seat. Razor vaulted through the rear doors and pulled them closed behind him, the panhead between him and the back of the cab, bracing the machine against his legs and the van walls as the van lurched into reverse. The tires found no traction in the gravel and found it anyway the way things find what they need when the need is acute. The van went backward fast. It took the chain link gate in the middle. The padlock had been resecured, which did not matter because the van's front bumper had opinions about chain link that it expressed completely and immediately. The gate went sideways off its track and the van was through it, and Bear was shifting into drive before the gate finished falling. The van fishtailed on the road surface outside, caught, straightened, accelerated. Behind them, the smoke from the Pruitt compound rose in a dark column against the desert sky. Dale Pruitt's voice was audible for approximately 2 seconds before the distance made it irrelevant, a sustained, diminishing sound that the desert absorbed the same way it absorbed everything else. Inside the van, in the silence that arrives after a contained and violent event, when the adrenaline is still fully present, but the situation that required it has ended, the 4 occupants breathed. Colt turned in his seat. He looked at Ruth. She was sitting with the revolver in her lap, both hands still on it, still shaking with the fine tremor of controlled fury. Her face was pale in the way that a face goes pale when the blood has been directed elsewhere by the body's management of an emergency and is only now returning. Her eyes were closed. "Ruth," Colt said. She opened her eyes. "You all right?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked down at the revolver in her lap. Then she looked back at Bohm. "I haven't fired that gun," she said, "since 1978. He held her eyes for a moment. Then something moved through his chest that was not a thought and was not a feeling, but was both simultaneously the feeling of recognizing someone. Not recognizing them from before, recognizing them from the inside, recognizing the substance of them, the weight of who they are. "Razor," he said, turning forward again. "Boss? You're bleeding." "Yeah," Razor said with the indifference of a man who has cataloged the damage and filed it under manageable. "Nothing structural." "Bear." "Still got the bike," Bear said. He glanced in the rearview mirror at the machine wedged behind him. "She's banged up, but she came out the same way she went in. Everything that matters is still attached." Colt looked out through the windshield at the highway opening ahead of them. The sun was fully committed to its descent, now the western horizon going orange and red, and the deep purple that Arizona evenings produce in the last 30 minutes before dark falls completely. He said, "Take us home. Don't stop for lights." The garage of the Iron Horse Saloon had been cleared for the purpose. The prospects were outside the perimeter. The doors were closed. The remaining senior members stood around the motorcycle that Bear had positioned in the center of the garage floor under the full spread of the fluorescent lights. The panhead looked different here than it had in the shed in Bullhead City. In Bullhead City, it had been surrounded by the visual noise of junk and metal and the contextual chaos of the situation in which it was found. Here, under clean light isolated, it was simply itself, a machine. A specific extraordinary machine built in 1958 by the Harley-Davidson Motor Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, customized by a 24-year-old man named Jack Calloway in a rented garage in Phoenix and ridden north on a fall night in 1974 toward a destiny that did not include what actually happened. Ruth sat on a stool near the wall. Someone had produced a cup of tea, actual Earl Grey, in an actual cup, which had required Rook to make a phone call and send a prospect to the gas station Minimart 2 miles down the road, and had been delivered with the seriousness that the situation now warranted. She held the cup in both hands. She watched Colt pull on a pair of heavy work gloves. He picked up the angle grinder. The machine was small in his hands. He checked the cutting disc, positioned himself, and looked at the tank. "If you're wrong about the cavity," Razor said from his right, "we're cutting a perfectly good antique gas tank for nothing." Colt had already tapped the tank twice more since they arrived. The sound was unambiguous to him. "I'm not wrong," he said. He set the disc against the underside of the tank. The grinder screamed. Sparks fell in a bright shower, cascading down to the garage floor and dying. The smell of hot metal filled the space. The men standing around the motorcycle watched the disc cut its careful square through the steel one side, a turn the second side, a turn, the third, the fourth, the geometry of an opening being made in something that was sealed. Colt killed the grinder. He used a pair of pliers to work the cut square of metal up and back, bending it on the uncut edge that served as a hinge. It required more force than the first application, then gave suddenly the metal fatigued at the corners of the cut. Beneath it was blackness, a small cave of dark space where the welded false floor of the tank created a cavity perhaps 4 inches deep across the full diameter of the tank. Something dripped, a slow black drip, the residue of decades of oil and moisture, and the chemistry of slow deterioration, the liquid record of time's work on a sealed space. Flashlight, Colt said. Razor had it ready. The beam went into the cavity. In the circle of light at the back of the cavity, against the original wall of the tank, an object, wrapped in canvas. Oil-soaked dark, compressed by decades of pressure from the weight of what had pooled above it. But present, occupying space. Dimensional. Real. Colt reached in with his gloved hand. He worked the package free slowly because the cavity was not designed for retrieval. It was designed for concealment, designed to be found only by someone who knew what they were looking for and was willing to cut the tank open to find it. He worked it free and brought it out and set it on the workbench. It was heavy, heavier than the wrapping alone accounted for. The canvas was military surplus, its original color indistinguishable beneath the oil saturation. Colt cut the twine that bound it. He unwrapped the layers with care because the canvas had the texture of something that might not survive impatient handling. Inside the canvas was a metal ammunition box, small, approximately the size of a thick hardcover book, sealed with wax that had been applied in a careful bead around the seam of the lid. The wax was cracked. Not fully broken, cracked. The seal had failed at some point in some degree. Colt pried the lid with a flathead screwdriver. The first thing visible was paper. A document in a clear plastic sleeve, yellowed at the edges where the sleeve had not fully protected it, but legible, preserved in its essential content by the sleeve in the box and the care of a 24-year-old man who had understood that what he was carrying required whatever protection he could provide. Colt picked it up. He read it slowly. He read it the way a man reads something, when every sentence has weight, not scanning, not absorbing, but receiving it word by word and allowing each word its full significance before moving to the next. Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, Kingman Charter, Articles of Establishment, 1974. The national seal of the organization in the upper right corner, faded but present. The date October 3rd, 1974. 14 days before Jack Calloway was run off the road on Route 40. The territory map hand-drawn covering the geographic boundaries of the Kingman Charter's claimed region. The signatures, 6 of them, the original founding members' names that Colt had never seen, but that he looked at now with the attention of a man reading a founding document. And at the bottom of the page, a counter-signature, the national president of the organization at that time, a name Colt knew from the history of the thing he had given his life to. And beneath the counter-signature, the 6-member signature, Jack Calloway. Ghost. The room was quiet. The charter never dissolved, Razor said. His voice had the quality of a man thinking aloud, working through implications in real time. It was established. It was signed by National. It just never got filed because the man carrying it died before he could file it. Which means it exists, Colt said. Which means it has existed under club law since 1974. Which means every inch of this territory has been sanctioned for 40 years and no one knew it. He looked at the Copperheads problem through the lens of this document, and the problem restructured itself entirely. The 8 months of pressure, the strategic, sustained testing of the perimeter. Someone had told them the Kingman Charter had no founding documentation on record. Someone had given them the understanding that the territory was technically unclaimed under national club law and therefore contestable. And someone had been wrong. Colt set the document down on the workbench with the care of a man handling something he intends to protect going forward. He looked back into the ammunition box. Below the document, below the plastic sleeve, was the second layer of the box's contents. He could see the edges of it beneath the sleeve, the distinctive color of old currency, the green and gray of U.S. bills, the organized density of money bundled and stacked. He lifted the document out of the way. He looked at the money. Then he picked up a bundle. The bills did not separate. They did not fan. They did not behave like money. They held together with the compressed, fused rigidity of something that has been wet and dried and compressed and deteriorated through more cycles than paper and ink are designed to survive. The top bill of the bundle was recognizable as a $50 denomination, the numeral visible in the corner, the general design coherent. Below the top bill, the ink had run, had migrated, had bled through from one bill to the next and back and forward again in the irreversible chemistry of moisture working on printed currency over a sustained period. The bills had fused into a single mass, not paper anymore, not usable, not exchangeable, not anything except a compressed record of what they had once been. Colt set the bundle down. He picked up a second bundle. The same. He set it next to the first. The $50,000 that Jack Calloway had hidden for his wife and his unborn child that had waited 40 years in a sealed cavity in a midnight blue gas tank that Ruth Calloway had traveled a mile through 104 degrees of Arizona heat on a bad hip to retrieve was a block of compressed, fused, irrecoverable material that retained the shape of money and the memory of money and nothing else. The garage was absolutely silent. Colt turned around. Ruth Calloway was standing up from her stool. She had been watching. She had seen everything from the moment the angle grinder began to the moment Colt set the second bundle down. She had watched the document come out, had seen its significance register on the face of every man in the room, and she had seen the money come out after it, and she had read in the way Colt held the bundle and the way he set it down, everything she needed to read. She stood with her cane. She did not move toward the workbench. She stood where she was and looked at it from across the garage floor, and her face did the thing that faces do when a long-held hope reaches the end of the road it was traveling and finds no continuation. Not despair, not collapse. Something quieter and more exhausted than either of those. The face of someone who has been carrying something for so long that the putting it down, even when the putting down is loss rather than resolution, produces something that is almost like relief. All for nothing, she said. The words were not loud. They were the words of a woman speaking something to herself, something she had perhaps always known might be waiting at the end of this road, something she had refused to acknowledge until this moment, because the acknowledgement would have required stopping, and stopping was not something she had been willing to do. She turned. She picked up her red bag from beside the stool. She moved toward the door of the garage, her cane marking the concrete floor, her small figure crossing the space between the workbench and the exit, with the deliberate, painful care of a body that has given everything it had today and has not yet received anything back. "At least you got your history, Colt," she said without turning around. Her voice carried the last reserves of the controlled, steady register she had maintained from the moment she stepped off the Greyhound. "I'm tired. I just want to go home." And Colt Decker stood at the workbench with the founding documents of his chapter in his right hand and a block of ruined money in his left, and he watched the woman who had brought him both of them walk toward the door, and something moved in him that was not a thought and was not a feeling and was not a decision, but was all three of those things simultaneously the way the most important moments tend to be. "Ruth," he said. She stopped. She did not turn around. Not yet. Part 3. What a Man Owes. She stood at the door of the garage with her hand not quite on the handle and her cane planted on the concrete between her feet, and she waited the way a person waits when they are not certain they want to hear what comes next and are also not able to make themselves leave before they hear it. The garage held its silence for a moment. The fluorescent lights hummed. The panhead sat in the center of the floor under that light stripped of its tarpaulin and its mystery, its gas tank, open its decades of hidden cargo, now visible on the workbench, one irreplaceable document in a plastic sleeve, and one ruined brick of what had once been $50,000. Colt set both items down. He looked at the men standing around the motorcycle. 4 senior members bare to his left, Razor to his right, 2 others who had been in this club for a combined total of 31 years, and who had in that time seen a range of things that would not have been believed by people who had not seen them. He looked at each of them in turn. Not long, just long enough to communicate what he was about to say before he said it. Then he looked at the door, at the small figure standing in front of it with her back to the room. "Empty your pockets," he said. Razor turned his head. The question was on his face before it reached his mouth. "Right now," Colt said. "Everything. On the bench." He reached into his own vest first. In the inside left pocket, he kept the club's operational cash, the dues collected at the previous week's meeting, the earnings from the club's legitimate enterprises, the specific roll of bills that constituted the chapter's weekly liquidity. He pulled it out. He set it on the workbench next to the ruined money and the founding document, without ceremony, without hesitation, the way a man sets something down when the decision about whether to set it down has already been made and what remains is only the physical act. Razor watched him do it. Then Razor reached into his jacket. He produced his wallet. He opened it and extracted the cash from it, several $100s in mixed bills, the accumulated working cash of a man who operates primarily in cash because cash is untraceable, and untraceable is a quality Razor had valued for 22 years. He set it on the bench. He paused. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his cut and removed something he set next to the cash, with a care that indicated it cost him something to set it there. It was a watch, a man's dress watch gold case, leather band, the kind of watch that is given rather than purchased, that exists in a man's possession, not because he chose it, but because someone who mattered to him did. He set it on the bench without comment. Bear Malone was already at the rear of the van, which had been backed into the garage beside the motorcycle. He came back holding a folded piece of paper. He set it on the bench and smoothed it once with his wide hand and stepped back. It was a title. The certificate of title to a 2009 Harley-Davidson Softail, registered to one Bernard K. Malone, the legal name that appeared on Bear's documents and nowhere else in his daily life. The motorcycle the title represented was parked outside in the Iron Horse lot and was by current market valuation worth approximately $11,000. Bear stepped back from the bench. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked at the floor with the expression of a man who has done what he intended to do and is not interested in discussing it. The two other senior members had been watching. They did not need further instruction. Dewey, a compact, weathered man who had been with the club since 1989 and who managed the club's financial affairs with the meticulous, slightly anxious competence of someone who understands money well enough to be genuinely afraid of what happens when it runs out, went to the locked metal cabinet on the wall of the garage. He unlocked it with a key from his ring and removed a canvas bag, which he brought to the bench and set down. The bag made the sound of bundled paper, a soft, compressed, significant sound. The emergency fund. 3 months of accumulated reserves set aside for the contingency of bail legal fees and the various other financial emergencies that attend the operation of a motorcycle club through time. Dewey set it on the bench. He looked at Colt. Colt nodded once. The second senior member, a tall man named Garris, who had spent 11 years as a long-haul trucker before joining the club, and who had retained from that period a fundamental practicality about money and distance and the relationship between them, pulled 4 banded stacks of currency from the inside of his boot. He set them on the bench with no expression at all because Garris's face operated on a minimal expression policy that had served him well across 51 years of life in circumstances that rewarded the withholding of readable reactions. From the main room of the saloon through the door that connected the garage to the bar came the sound of Rook navigating the doorway with something in his hands. He came through carrying a glass jar, the kind that had once held pickles, now holding a collection of bills and coins and the occasional folded slip of paper. The swear jar. It had been sitting behind the bar at the Iron Horse for 7 years, and its contents had never been formally earmarked for any purpose, the understanding being that the purpose would make itself clear when it arrived. Rook set the jar on the bench without a word and went back to the bar. Colt looked at what was on the workbench. He counted it with the practiced speed of a man for whom counting cash is a functional skill rather than an impressive one. The total was $22,460 in cash, plus the title to Bear's Softail, plus Razor's watch, plus the contents of the swear jar, which added another $400 and some change when he worked through it. From the corner of the garage, a voice. "I've got $4,000 in my locker." It was a prospect, the youngest one, a kid of 23 named Fitch, who had been with the club for 7 months and who had spoken up in a meeting of senior members at a moment that nobody had invited him into, which was technically a violation of the specific hierarchy of the room he was standing in, and which nobody pointed out because the moment did not require pointing that out. Fitch was looking at the floor when he said it. He was clearly uncertain about whether he had overstepped. He had clearly decided that the possibility of overstepping was less important than the fact of the thing he'd said. Colt looked at him for a moment. "Get it," he said. Fitch went. The collection on the bench had grown to something in the neighborhood of $26,000 in cash, an equivalence before Colt turned away from it. He picked up the canvas bag from the emergency fund and moved the cash, the title, the watch, and the contents of the swear jar into it with the same methodical efficiency with which he did most things that required doing. He closed the bag. He walked to where Ruth Calloway was still standing at the door. She had turned around at some point during the preceding minutes. She was facing the room. She had watched all of it, had watched each man move to the bench and leave something on. It had watched the pile grow from nothing to something, had watched the prospective member appear in the corner of the room and say what he had said and go to retrieve what he had offered. She had watched all of it with her hands on the cane and her red bag over her wrist and her face doing what faces do when they are receiving something too large to process in the moment and are instead simply recording it for later when the quiet comes and the processing is possible. Colt stopped in front of her. He held out the bag. "Jack left you 50, he said. "Club acts as the bank. We're short of the principal." He said this without apology and without explanation because the situation did not require either. It required the bag extended and the words accurate. We'll make up the difference, he said. It'll take us time, but it'll get made up. Ruth looked at the Bemoink. She looked at his face. The pale blue eyes were bright in the way that eyes go bright when the moisture behind them is the product of something other than sadness, when the thing producing it is more complicated than sadness and doesn't have a single clean name. I can't take your money, she said. Her voice had broken somewhere in the previous sentence and was carrying the break forward. It isn't our money, Colt said. It's yours. It was in the tank the whole time. We just cleaned the bills for you. He pressed the bag gently into her hands. She took it. She held it against her chest the way she had held the red bag when she walked into the Iron Horse Saloon that afternoon, with both hands the white knuckles of someone holding something they do not intend to release. Her head dropped forward once briefly and then came back up, and she looked at the men standing in the garage around the motorcycle and said nothing, because what was in the room at that moment did not require language, and she understood that. Then she said quietly, "Can I sit with you?" The question she had asked at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in a different room, in a different version of the same moment. Colt looked at her for a long moment. "Ruth," he said, "you don't have to ask." He pulled a chair from against the wall and set it beside the panhead in the center of the garage under the full spread of the fluorescent light. He set it facing the motorcycle so that the view from the chair was the view of the bike at close range. The tank opened, the chrome catching the light, the midnight blue visible even now through the grime. She sat, and for a while nobody spoke, and the garage held the quality of a room in which something important has just been decided, and all the people in it know it and are giving it the space it deserves. 3 weeks after the Tuesday at the Iron Horse Saloon, Colt Decker made the call to the National Council. He made it from the back office of the saloon on a landline with the founding document of the Kingman Charter laid flat on the desk in front of him. The call lasted 40 minutes. Colt spoke for perhaps 8 of those minutes in the minimal accurate register of a man presenting facts to an authority he respects and has prepared for the conversation adequately. He answered questions for the remaining time. He was precise about the document's provenance. He was precise about the chain of custody. He was precise about the circumstances of the charter's non-filing in 1974 and the circumstances under which the document had been recovered. The council confirmed 11 days after the call in a written communication delivered through the club's established channels that the Kingman Charter was a valid sanctioned establishment as of its founding date in October 1974 and had at no point been formally dissolved, suspended, or revoked. The territory described in the founding documents maps was confirmed as sanctioned Hells Angels ground. The Copperheads received their own communication from the national structure 2 days after that. The communication was not long. The Copperheads were given 30 days to vacate the operational territory they had been occupying under their mistaken assumption of its uncontested status. The enforcement mechanism, if they chose not to comply, was not described in the communication, because it did not need to be described. The architecture of what it meant to receive such a communication was sufficiently self-explanatory to make description redundant. The Copperheads complied. Not without noise, there was noise. There were communications that required response. There were several days of the tension that precedes either resolution or escalation, but they complied. Because the document was real, and the counter-signature was real, and the territory was real, and 40 years of contested ground turned out in the end to have been settled in October 1974 by a 24-year-old man with long hair and a reckless grin who had understood what he was carrying and had done everything he could to protect it. Ruth Calloway did not know the details of this for some time. She had gone back to Tucson after the Tuesday, back to the apartment she had been living in for 11 years, back to the quiet of a life reduced to its essential dimensions by the nature of what was happening in her body. She had the money from the canvas bag deposited in an account she opened for her grandson, Owen. She had an appointment with her oncologist every 2 weeks. She had the schedule of a person managing the logistics of their own dying with the organized competence of someone who spent 40 years managing other people's information and has not entirely retired from that professional formation. Colt called her on the first Friday of November. She answered on the third ring, one more ring than she took for numbers she recognized, and one fewer than she took for numbers she didn't. She had added his number to her phone on the Tuesday in the parking lot of the Iron Horse before she got into the cab she had called to take her back to the Greyhound station. He told her about the charter confirmation. He told her in the same minimal, accurate way he told most things. She was quiet while he spoke, and quiet for a moment after he finished. Then she said, "He did it then." Not a question, a confirmation. the verbal form of something that has been believed for 40 years without evidence being confirmed, with evidence received not with surprise, but with the particular stillness of a thing finally put to rest. He did it, Colt said. She was quiet again for a moment. Thank you for telling me, she said. He called her again the following Friday, and the Friday after that. The calls were not long, they did not cover a great deal of ground. They were in their essential nature the kind of calls that exist not primarily for the information they exchange, but for the simple function of two people knowing that the other is present and intends to remain so. In December, the calls stopped being sufficient. It was Razor who drove down to Tucson to collect her, which surprised Ruth, who had expected Colt, and who opened the door of her apartment to find Razor Tully in the hallway with his hands in his jacket pockets and his scar and his direct, unapologetic eyes. Boss sent me, Razor said, which was true but was also not the complete picture, which was that Colt had mentioned the situation and Razor had said he'd handle it before Colt had finished the sentence, because Razor's understanding of what the situation required and what Colt's particular formation made it difficult for Colt to do without complication had not changed since the two men had known each other. Ruth brought 2 bags. Razor put them in the car without comment. She came back to Kingman, to a room that had been arranged for her on the 2nd floor of the building adjacent to the Iron Horse, a room that had been used for storage and that had been cleared and cleaned and furnished over the course of 3 days by a collection of men who approached interior decor with the same focused, slightly anxious competence they brought to tasks outside their primary expertise, and who had produced something that was not beautiful by conventional standards, but was clean and warm and sufficient. She lived in that room through December and into January. The club adjusted itself around her presence the way a working organism adjusts around a new element, not without friction, not without the occasional moment of recalibration, but with the fundamental adaptability of an organization that has survived decades of changing circumstances by remaining clear about what matters and flexible about everything else. The prospects learned to knock before entering the adjacent hallway. Bear brought her breakfast on the mornings he was present, which was most mornings because Bear's schedule had quietly reorganized itself toward a morning presence at the Iron Horse that had not previously been a feature of it. Razor maintained his external inscrutability and checked on her through the wall each evening with a specific knock, 2 short, 1 long, that they had established without discussion as a sufficient and non-intrusive signal of continued operational status on both sides of the plaster. Colt came in the evenings. He came the way he did most things that mattered to him across his adult life, without announcement, without ceremony, without the verbal apparatus that people sometimes use around important things to establish the importance of them. He simply came. He sat in the chair beside her bed or the chair beside her window, depending on where she was, and he stayed for an hour, sometimes 2, and they talked about things that were not always connected to the situation they were in, and were sometimes simply the conversations of 2 people who have arrived at the point in each other's company where the range of available topics has become wide rather than narrow. She told him about the library in Tucson, about the particular satisfaction of reference work, the way a good reference librarian is essentially a navigator, taking someone's imprecise sense of a destination and finding the exact route to it. She told him about Owen as a child, about the visits she had been allowed through the years of his growing up, about the quality of watching a child become a person when you are present only intermittently, and each visit shows you the most recent revision of someone you love. He told her about Kuwait, about the desert there and how it was the same color as Arizona and completely different in its feel, its flatness, its relationship with the men moving through it. He told her about coming back, about the Greyhound terminal in Flagstaff, about his mother's arms with a strength that surprised him. He did not tell her about the trailer park in 2008, not in those early weeks. That came later when the nights were longer and the conversations had run long enough to reach the things that wait at the back of conversations for sufficient cover. When he told her, she listened without interruption, complete unhurried attention, the professional habit of a person who has spent decades helping other people find what they were looking for and who understood that the first requirement of that work is listening to what is actually being said, rather than what you expect to hear. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You couldn't knock, she said. No, he said, because if you knocked and no one answered, that was the end of it. He looked at the window. Outside, the Arizona night was cold, in the way that desert nights are cold absolutely without reservation, the same landscape that had been ruthless with heat 12 hours earlier. Now ruthless with cold, the temperature having traveled the full range available to it in the course of a single dem. If I didn't knock, he said, I could still be the man who was about to. She thought about this for a long time in the way she thought about most things, not visibly, not with the external signs of consideration, but with the internal completeness of someone doing a real thing rather than a performed one. Jack was already gone when I arrived at the hospital in 1974, she said. I drove 4 hours because someone called me and said he had been in an accident, and I drove 4 hours, and when I got there, he was already gone. She paused. I stood in the parking lot of that hospital for a long time before I went inside, because inside was where the confirmation was, and outside it was still only a phone call. He looked at her. The parking lot, she said, was the last place where it might not be true. He sat with that for a while. You went in, he said. I went in, she said. He nodded once slowly with the physical completeness of a man receiving something and placing it where it belongs. He came back the next evening, and the one after that. The chair beside the window became the chair that was his, not by assignment, but by repetition, by the accumulation of evenings that had established a pattern the room itself came to expect. The cancer did not hurry. This was the particular cruelty of it, not its pace, but its patience, its willingness to take the time it intended to take without reference to what the people involved would have preferred. Ruth managed it the way she managed most things, practically without self-pity, with the organized attention of someone who understands that the work of dying, like most work, is mostly administration and requires the same focused competence as any other sustained task. She was admitted to Kingman Regional Medical Center in the second week of February, room 304. The room had a window that faced east, which meant that the mornings when she was most alert were lit by early desert light, clear still, the kind of light that makes the world look briefly like it has been cleaned overnight. The nursing staff on the third floor had by the end of the first week adjusted to the unusual composition of the waiting room. The Hells Angels of the Kingman chapter did not blend naturally into the aesthetic of a hospital waiting room. They were aware of this and were not particularly concerned about it because their concern was directed elsewhere. They filled the available seating and overflowed into the hallway in rotating shifts, the way people fill space when the space is insufficient, but the reason for being there is not negotiable. They brought their own coffee because the hospital coffee was by unanimous assessment an insult to the concept. Bear had identified the specific hospital coffee machine and had taped a handwritten note to it that read "condemned," which the nursing staff removed and which reappeared the following morning. Colt came in the evenings as he had come to the room adjacent to the Iron Horse in the evenings. He came after the day's business was managed and the club was settled, and he sat in the chair beside Ruth's bed, and they continued the conversation that had been running since October. Razor maintained the hallway. He stood or sat outside room 304 with the patient, implacable presence of a man on a post, acknowledging the nurses when they passed with a nod exactly calibrated to be polite without being familiar. One evening in March, Ruth asked Colt about the bike. "Is it going to be finished?" she said. He looked at her. Outside the window, the desert was running through its evening colors, orange giving way to purple, giving way to the dense blue that preceded full dark. "It's going to be finished," he said. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. "I want to hear it run." "You'll hear it," he said. The work on the motorcycle had been ongoing since November. It had begun the week after the Bullhead City trip, when the charter confirmation was still pending, and the situation was still in motion, and Colt had walked into the garage one morning and looked at the panhead on the floor and made a recognition rather than a decision. The recognition that the machine deserved to be returned to what it had been, and that the returning of it was something the club could do, and therefore would do, and that this was the most complete and accurate statement available to them about what they understood their obligation to be. He had not announced it as a project. He had simply begun. He had begun the disassembly himself on a Sunday morning in early November, pulling the engine from the frame with Razor's assistance, setting the components on the workbench in the order of disassembly that would guide the order of reassembly. Bear had arrived in the afternoon and had taken over the frame cleaning without being asked, because Bear had looked at the frame and at the tools and had understood what was needed and had simply begun doing it. The restoration grew the way the collection on the workbench had grown on the Tuesday evening, by the accretion of individual commitments, each one made without negotiation, without solicitation, by men who understood what the motorcycle represented and who had skills directly applicable to returning it to what it should be. The engine was rebuilt from a bare block. Gaskets, bearings, valves, seats, the components of a 1958 panhead that had to be sourced from suppliers who specialized in the irreplaceable parts of machines that are no longer manufactured. The chrome work was sent to a shop in Phoenix that did nothing but restoration chrome, the fishtail pipes, the headlight ring, the handlebar clamps, the primary cover. Each piece came back mirror finished, the kind of chrome that holds light the way still water holds a reflection. The tank was repaired where the cutting had opened, it welded closed, smoothed the false bottom, removed, but the cavity sealed so that the tank was once again functional. The paint was mixed to match the original, color that required 3 attempts to get exactly right because the midnight blue that Jack Calloway had chosen was not a standard color, and the existing paint on the tank had its own particular character that had to be matched rather than approximated. It cost $20,000. It took 91 days. It was the most careful thing the Kingman chapter had collectively made in the 9 years since Colt had taken the presidency, and it was made without any formal discussion of why it was being made and without any question from any member about whether it should be. The night of March 17th was cold. Colt arrived at room 304 at 2:30 in the morning. He had been called by the night nurse, a woman named Patricia, who had over the preceding 6 weeks developed a working understanding of the communication protocols of the people managing the vigil outside room 304, and who had learned that Colt Decker was the correct call when the situation required a decision. The room was dim. The monitors cast their blue-green light across the surfaces, the ongoing display of a body's vital information rendered in numbers and waveforms, the translation of a human life into data that machines could track and report. Ruth's breathing was audible from the doorway, a slow, labored sound, each breath taken with an effort that was present in the sound of it, in the quality of the pause between exhale and the next inhale. Colt sat in his chair. He took her hand. Her hand in his was the hand of a woman who had been small her whole life and had become smaller, the bird-bone lightness of someone whose body has been reassigning its resources for some time, directing them away from the periphery and toward the center, the way any managed resource is directed when the supply is limited. He sat with her for a while. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his vest and took out his phone. He found the file he had saved there 3 days earlier after the last test run in the garage when the engine had turned over for the first time in 40 years and had settled into the idle rhythm of a rebuilt panhead, that distinctive syncopated rolling sound that is the Harley sound reduced to its oldest and most essential version. He had recorded 30 seconds of it on his phone and had listened to it several times since, not for the sound itself, but for what he intended to do with it. He pressed play. The sound that came from the phone speaker in the quiet of room 304 at 2:30 in the morning was small relative to the actual sound of the engine in the garage, but it was accurate. It was the right sound. The specific, unmistakable living rhythm of a 1958 panhead at idle, the potato of an engine designed and built and ridden 60 years ago, and now returned to the condition in which it could be ridden again. Ruth's eyes had been closed. As the sound began, something changed in her face. The effortful set of her expression, the muscular work of a body managing pain and diminishment, eased, not disappeared, eased the way a face eases when a familiar and beloved thing reaches it through whatever channel remains available. Her lips moved. He leaned in. "It sounds like Jack," she said. The words were barely voiced breath, with the shape of words assembled from what was available. He waited. "It sounds like 1974, she said. He kept his hand around hers and his head close enough to hear her, and he said, "It's ready, Ruth. It's waiting for him." The corner of her mouth moved. It was the ghost of the smile she had given him in the Iron Horse Saloon when she had said, "Drive. I'll tell you the rest on the way." The same smile stripped to its essential component, which was not humor and was not warmth exactly, but was the expression of a woman who has lived inside a difficult truth for a long time and has found at the end of it something that resembles peace. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me sit with you." He sat with that for a moment. "Ruth," he said. His voice had traveled somewhere. It did not often go into a register that cost him something, that required something of him. The day-to-day operation of his life did not require. "You didn't just sit with us." He paused. "You rode with us." The monitor continued its work for 10 more minutes. Then at 17 minutes before 3 in the morning on March 18, 2014, the waveform went flat and stayed flat, and the sound that replaced it was the tone of a machine that has finished its measurement, because the thing it was measuring has ended. Colt did not call the nurse immediately. He sat for a while in the blue-green light with her hand in his, in the unrepeatable silence of a room in which something has just concluded. And he stayed there until he had done what he needed to do, with the staying there, which took as long as it took, and was not hurried, because this was the room and this was the woman, and this time he was on the right side of the door. He had been 20 minutes too late to knock in 2001. He had been present for everything in 2014. The difference between those two moments was the distance a man can travel in 13 years if he understands what he is traveling toward. The funeral of Ruth Calloway was scheduled for the 23rd of March, a Saturday at Mountain View Cemetery on the northeastern edge of Kingman. The local police were informed, as they are informed of events in communities where the relevant information affects operational planning. The notification generated a response that involved 3 patrol units positioned at the cemetery entrance and 2 more on the approach roads, a reasonable and proportionate response given the nature of the notification. What the police observed and would discuss for years afterward in the way that law enforcement discusses things that depart from their prepared categories was not what they had been prepared for. The procession appeared on Route 66 at 10:30 in the morning. It appeared in the way that things appear when they are larger than the available frame first, as sound felt rather than heard, a vibration in the road surface that preceded the visible evidence, a wave that moved through the asphalt before the machines producing it came into view. Then, as a sound growing from a low collective rumble into something that filled the corridor of the highway and exceeded it, that bounced off the rock faces on the northern side of the road and returned amplified, that caused the birds in the sparse vegetation along the shoulder to lift and scatter. Then visible chrome. Hundreds of chrome elements catching the March Arizona sun. Then the machines themselves coming around the curve in the highway with the ordered, deliberate pace of a formal procession, not the rolling thunder of bikes running wide open, but the measured, intentional speed of a column moving in ceremony. Colt Decker led the procession alone, 30 feet ahead of the main body on his own machine. Behind him came Razor Tully and Bear Malone, riding in a formation that carried a gap in its right side, a space of deliberate absence. The front right position maintained empty in the missing man formation that the military uses to honor the absent, which the club had adapted for the same purpose. Behind them came the chapter. And behind the chapter came the riders who had come from elsewhere. They had come from the Purdue Charter, the oldest, from the Oakland Charter, the foundational, from the Cave Creek Charter and the Nomad Charter, and the charters whose names represented the geography of the western United States mapped in club history. They had come because the word had moved through the wire, through the communication network of an organization that has maintained its own channels for 60 years. And the word had said that the grandmother of the Kingman Charter, the woman who had carried the proof of its existence for 40 years and had brought it home, was being buried in the desert she had lived in, and the appropriate response to that information was presence. 200 riders, 3 miles of chrome and black leather on Route 66. The 3 police units at the cemetery entrance did not move from their positions, but the officers within them did not move either. They sat and watched the column pass with the expressions of people witnessing something that has exceeded the category they placed it in before they saw it. At Mountain View Cemetery, the machines shut down in sequence, the sound dying engine by engine, until the silence that followed was the resonant silence that is the absence of a very large sound and is felt in the body as its own kind of presence. The grave had been prepared at the upper end of the cemetery, where the ground began to rise toward the limestone ridge that formed the cemetery's northern boundary. A modest stone, Ruth Calloway, the dates, and below them at Colt's instruction, 2 words she wrote. The priest was a young man recently assigned to the Kingman parish who had not previously officiated at a service with this particular composition of attendees, and who performed his function with the efficient, slightly accelerated delivery of a man who understands that his role is to complete the liturgical requirements and then step aside. He completed them competently. He stepped aside. Colt stepped forward. He stood at the edge of the open grave and looked down at the casket plain pine, because that was what Ruth had specified in the document she had given him in February, in which she had organized with librarian precision the instructions for the administration of her death. He looked at it for a moment in the full late March morning sun, the wind coming off the high ground behind him and moving his beard, 200 men standing behind him in silence. He reached into his vest. The patch he produced was a bottom rocker, a curved piece of embroidered fabric, the lower of the 3 pieces of the club's back patch, the one that names the region. He held it for a moment. Then he placed it on the casket. "Kingman," he said. His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. 200 men in a quiet cemetery heard every word with the attention of people who understood what the words were doing. "Ride in peace, sister." 200 engines started within 30 seconds of each other. The sound built from individual voices into something collective. The combined voice of 200 Harley-Davidson motorcycles idling in a desert cemetery, a sound that the limestone ridge behind them caught and returned, and that the morning absorbed, and that the desert retained for as long as the desert retains anything which is longer than the people passing through it tend to understand. On the eastern side of the cemetery, away from the grave and the departing column of bikes, Colt walked toward a small group of people who had arranged themselves at a distance from the proceedings in the way that people arrange themselves when they are uncertain of their welcome in a situation whose social architecture they don't fully understand. The group was small, two older women who appeared to be distant cousins standing together with the closed posture of people who want to leave but feel the obligation to remain. A man in his late 40s consulting his phone with the concentration of someone who finds it more navigable than the situation he's in. And apart from the others, against a low headstone, a young man. He was 24 years old. He was wearing a suit that did not fit him correctly, the jacket too large in the shoulders, the trousers hemmed for someone slightly shorter, the entire ensemble carrying the quality of clothes that have been borrowed or purchased for occasions that don't arise often and have not been sized for the specific body wearing them. He had the same jawline as the man in the 1974 Polaroid. He had the same proportion of features. He had none of the reckless grin, because the reckless grin belongs to people who have not yet met the consequences that rearrange it, and Owen Calloway had met enough of those to have a more considered expression, watchful, self-contained, with a directness in the eyes that assessed the world rather than assumed it. He saw Colt coming, and he moved immediately in the direction of more open space, not running, not panicking, but positioning himself away from the headstone with the instinctive movement of someone who has learned that having a route available is more comfortable than not having one. Colt stopped 3 feet from him. Owen looked at him with the wariness of someone trying to decide rapidly what the correct response to this situation is and does not yet have enough information to make the determination. "I don't want any trouble," Owen said. His voice was steady, which cost him something. "Whatever my grandmother owed, I don't have it, but I'll figure it out." "She didn't owe us anything," Colt said. "She paid her dues in full. We're the ones who owe her." Owen looked at him. "Walk with me," Colt said. He led Owen along the eastern edge of the cemetery past the rows of modest stones and the sparse desert plantings that the cemetery's groundskeeping sustained toward the road where the club's vehicles were parked. Among them at the far end, an enclosed trailer, Black Anonymous, attached to the cargo van that had carried a motorcycle in the other direction 6 months ago. Bear Malone was standing at the trailer's rear, not leaning, not lounging, standing in the way of someone on a post of formality he did not typically observe, but which the situation had apparently called out of him, because Bear's read of occasions was generally accurate and he had read this one as requiring formality. When he saw Owen, he nodded once. He reached for the trailer's rear latch. "Your grandmother told me about you," Colt said as they walked. "Said you weld, said you're good with your hands." "I get by," Owen said. "She wanted to leave you money," Colt said. $50,000. That was the plan Jack Calloway made for his family in 1974, and that Ruth spent 40 years trying to complete. The cash didn't survive. He paused. The world doesn't always work the way it's planned to. Owen looked at the ground. The suit jacket moved in the morning wind. "But," Colt said. He stopped walking. He was at the trailer's rear. Bear had the latch open and the ramp down, and the interior of the trailer was visible, dim, the objects inside present, but not yet resolved in the March morning light. "She left you something better than paper," Colt said. Bear walked up the ramp. Inside the trailer, the sound of wheels on metal, the sound of a motorcycle being moved from where it has been standing to where it is about to be presented. Bear's hands appeared at the top of the ramp on the handlebars, and then the front wheel appeared, and then the rest of the machine followed it down the ramp and into the full morning light of the 23rd of March in the cemetery parking lot in Kingman, Arizona, and the sun hit it the way the sun hits things that have been made to be seen. The tank was the color of deep water. It was the color of the sky at the moment before full dark, when the blue has gone as deep as blue can go and is about to become something else. The silver lightning bolt along the flank caught the sun and held it a ribbon of light moving through the midnight field. The chrome of the fishtail pipes reflected the limestone ridge behind them, the desert, the sky, the faces of the men standing near them, all of it present in the polished surface simultaneously. The leather of the seat was dark and precise, the hand-tooled pattern that Bear had spent 11 evenings producing, moving across the surface with the density of something made by a person who had no prior experience of the thing they were making and had committed to it completely. The 1958 Harley-Davidson Panhead stood in the morning light and was in every sense available to the moment extraordinary. Owen's mouth opened. He took one step toward the machine and then stopped as if the remaining distance required permission, as if arriving at the point where he could put his hands on it required something he hadn't yet been given. Is that, he started. That's your grandfather's motorcycle, Colt said. Ghost's panhead. We brought it back from where it had been, same as your grandmother brought back what had been lost. Owen moved to it. His right hand went to the tank. His fingers made contact with the midnight blue paint in exactly the way Ruth's fingers had made contact with the headlight in the shed in Bullhead City, with the careful reverence of someone who understands they are making contact with something that has history in it and is trying to receive that history through the point of contact. As Colt held out the keys, the cuff of his vest rode up an inch. The cross-shaped scar on his left wrist caught the March morning light. Old now, the edges of it softened by 23 years of desert weather, but still they're still legible. Owen looked at it. He looked at it the way a young man looks at the evidence of another man's life, when he is beginning to understand that evidence is what life leaves behind, and that most of it does not arrive with an explanation attached. He did not ask about it, but Colt, standing there with his arm extended and the scar visible in the morning sun, understood something he had not fully understood before. He had carried that mark for 23 years without assigning it, meaning beyond the moment that produced it, a piece of equipment, grabbed without thinking because the situation required something, grabbed immediately and thinking was a luxury. Standing now in this cemetery with the founding document of his chapter filed at the national level, and the dead acknowledged, and the bike finished, and the keys in his outstretched hand, he understood that the cross-shaped scar was simply this, the mark of a man who had grabbed what needed to be grabbed when the thinking would have been too slow. Ruth had her tattoo. He had his scar, both of them marked by the things they had done without waiting to be certain. Owen took the keys. He held them in his palm and looked at them, then at the bike, then at Colt. This is worth a lot of money, he said. His voice had gone quiet. To a collector, maybe 55, 60,000, Colt said. A man came up from Oakland last month and spent an hour with it. Didn't touch anything, just looked. Offered us 62. Owen looked up at him. We told him it wasn't for sale, Colt said. Because it isn't. He held the keys out. Because it's yours. Owen took them. He held them in his palm and looked at them, then looked at the bike, then looked at Colt. I don't know how to ride a suicide shift, he said. We'll teach you, Colt said. I can't take this, Owen said. The words had the texture of someone who has not previously been in the position of receiving something this large and does not yet have the language for how to be in that position. You're not taking it, Colt said. You're receiving it. There's a difference. He reached into his vest again and produced a business card. He held it out. Your grandmother told me you weld, said you've got a feel for fabrication, but you've never had the equipment or the space. He waited until Owen took the card. Iron Horse needs a full-time fabricator. Our man is retiring in April. It pays $25 an hour benefits, and you work in a shop that has every tool you're going to need to become the kind of craftsman you're capable of being. Monday morning, 9 o'clock. Owen looked at the card. He looked at it for a long time. Why would you do this? He said. The question was genuine, the question of a 24-year-old man who has learned through experience to understand the world as a place that does not generally extend this kind of thing without a corresponding cost, and who is trying to locate the cost in the present transaction and is not finding it. Colt looked at the grave in the upper part of the cemetery visible from where they stood, the fresh earth, the modest stone, the bottom rocker patch that would be retrieved later and mounted on the wall of the Iron Horse Saloon above the center table, where it would remain for as long as the saloon stood. Because 40 years ago, Colt said, this club failed your grandfather. He came out here to do something for us, and we didn't know he was here, and he died before we could know. And 40 years later, your grandmother carried the proof of what he'd done all the way to our door on a bad hip in 104 degrees, because she'd decided she was done being invisible. He paused. She gave us our history back. She ended a war we didn't know we were losing. And she did it for us, for you, for a man who'd been dead 40 years, and she asked for nothing except to sit at the table. He looked at Owen. This is what we owe, he said. This is us paying it. Owen looked at the bike. He looked at it for a long time, the way people look at things they are going to have to grow into, not with the ease of immediate possession, but with the more complex emotion of something accepted that will require becoming equal to. Then he put his leg over the seat. The suit jacket was still wrong. The trousers were still an inch too short. He looked in the objective sense like a young man in borrowed clothes who had never sat on a motorcycle with a suicide shift and who had a great deal to learn about the machine beneath him. But his hands went to the handlebars with a sureness that had nothing learned about it. His posture as his hands found the high-rise bars straightened from the uncertain watchful set it had held through the morning into something else, something more vertical, more settled, something the machine beneath him seemed to call out of him, the way a familiar song calls out a language you thought you'd forgotten. He sat up straight on the 1958 Panhead in the cemetery parking lot in Kingman, Arizona, and in the set of his shoulders, in the angle of his jaw, and the quality of his hands on the bars, he looked like the photograph. Not exactly. You can't be exactly someone else, not even the grandfather you never met, not even the one whose jawline you inherited, and whose hands appear to have remembered something they were never taught. But close enough that the men who had seen the photograph and were now looking at the boy on the bike felt the compression of time that occurs when the past and the present align along an unexpected axis. Bear Malone, standing at the foot of the ramp with his arms crossed and his face in its characteristic open arrangement, made a sound that he immediately covered with a cough, and then didn't bother to explain. Razor was looking at a point somewhere in the middle distance, and had been for a while. Colt put his hand on the seat of the Panhead next to Owen's leg and leaned in. "Don't sell it," he said. "I'm keeping it," Owen said. His voice was different than it had been 20 minutes ago. Steadier, claiming something. Forever. Colt stepped back. He looked at Owen on the bike for a moment, the suit, the keys in his hand, the straightened posture, the eyes looking at the road ahead rather than the ground. Then he walked back toward his own machine. The engines were starting around him. The column was reforming, preparing to move back onto Route 66, back toward Kingman and the Iron Horse, and the ongoing life of the chapter that now had its history confirmed on paper, and its territory established, and its debt, at least in the most immediate and measurable sense, beginning to be paid. He pulled his helmet on. He did not look back. He didn't need to. 2 years passed in the way that years pass in the desert, not slowly, not quickly, but with the patient consistency of a place that understands time in longer units than the people moving through it tend to use. Owen Calloway showed up at the Iron Horse Saloon at 8:52 on a Monday morning in April, 8 minutes early in the work clothes that fit him correctly, carrying a bag of personal tools he had assembled over the preceding weekend with the focused competence of someone who has been waiting for a particular kind of opportunity and has been thinking about what they would bring to it. He turned out to be good. Not competent good. He had the spatial intelligence that fabrication requires, the ability to see the finished form inside the raw material and to organize the steps between them in the correct sequence. He had patience with detail. He had the capacity to make the same adjustment 20 times until the adjustment was right, without the frustration that makes people accept close enough because the perfection is taking too long. He was also willing to be taught, which is a quality that sounds simple and is not. He could sit with not knowing something without the discomfort of not knowing becoming the most important thing in the room. He asked questions that were specific and listened to the answers with the same complete attention that his grandmother had brought to listening, which was not a coincidence. The shop opened 14 months after he started. A small building adjacent to the Iron Horse, built in stages over a winter by Owen and Bear, and two prospects who discovered in the course of the construction that they had more aptitude for carpentry than their life histories had suggested. Calloway Custom Fabrication. A hand-lettered sign over the door, the letters done by Owen himself in a style that owed something to the tradition of hand-painted gas tank lettering that had been practiced by men like Jack Calloway in rented garages in Phoenix in the early 1970s. The 1958 Panhead lived in the shop. It had its own space, a section of the main floor that had been cleared and floored with a different material than the rest, smoother, cleaner, as though the area had been designed to present something rather than to work on it. The bike stood in this space under a light positioned to show the tank, the chrome, the quality of the paint at different hours of the day as the light through the shop's west-facing windows changed. It was not for sale. This did not need to be posted anywhere because, within a range of several hundred miles among the people who would have had reason to make the inquiry, the information was simply known. Owen wrote it, not every day, on Sundays most weeks in the early morning before the heat arrived, and while the desert roads were quiet and the light was still lateral, still long and gold across the saguaro, and the rock still the light of beginning rather than the light of a day in full operation. He wrote it the way you ride something you intend to be riding for the rest of your life, carefully, fully present, with the attention of someone who understands that the relationship between a rider and a machine is built in hours and miles, and that the hours and miles are the thing and not merely the means to something else. There is a Tuesday morning in October in this story, 2 Octobers after the Tuesday that began it. The temperature outside the Iron Horse Saloon is 98 degrees, which is a moderation from 104 the kind of moderation the Arizona desert offers as its version of accommodation. Colt Decker is sitting outside on the bench against the front wall of the saloon in the shade of the overhang, with a cup of coffee and the quality of stillness that belongs to a man who has finished the portion of his life organized around the urgency of things unsettled and has arrived somewhere that is, if not exactly peace, a condition so closely adjacent to it as to be functionally indistinguishable. The chair inside the center table, the one with the best line of sight to the door, is still his. It will always be his. But on certain mornings he sits outside instead because outside the light is what the light is, and the desert is what the desert is, and the road goes where it goes, and these are things worth sitting with when a man has the time to sit with them. From the shop next door comes the sound of work, the high whine of a grinder, the lower register of a welding arc, the rhythmic sound of metal being shaped towards something it is not yet but will be. Colt listens to it. On the center table inside the Iron Horse Saloon in the best light in the room there is a framed photograph. It was taken in the cemetery parking lot on March 23, 2014, by a prospect who had a decent phone and the presence of mind to use it. The photograph shows a young man in a borrowed suit sitting on a 1958 Harley-Davidson Panhead in midnight blue with a lightning bolt along the tank. The young man's posture is straight. His hands are on the high-rise bars. He is not looking at the camera. He is looking at the road. Beside the frame, mounted on a small wooden block, is an embroidered bottom rocker. Kingman. On the wall above both of them, in the hand-lettering style of a man who learned his craft from the tradition of his grandfather, without knowing at the time of learning that this was what he was doing, is a line that is not long. It does not need to be long. She sat with us. She rode with us. And in the garage, the same garage under the same fluorescent light that hummed and flickered on the first night when the tank was opened and the document was found and the money was ruined and the debt began to be understood, Colt Decker stood alone. He stood in front of the 1958 Panhead that he had seen for the first time in a silk-wrapped Polaroid on a sticky table on an afternoon in October 2013. The machine that he had brought home from a burning junkyard in Bullhead City. The machine that 91 days of collective work had returned to what it should be, and that then traveled to a cemetery parking lot and then to a shop next door, where it stands now in its own designated space under its own designated light, waiting for Sunday mornings and quiet roads, in the hands of a young man who is still learning by accumulation what the machine requires of him. He had been standing like this the morning it began. He understood now as he had not fully understood then why he had been crying. He had been crying because the motorcycle was finished, and it was beautiful, and in a few hours it would be ridden down roads not unlike the ones its first rider had ridden by a young man who would carry forward into his own life something that had been waiting sealed inside 40 years of darkness and oil, and the patient keeping of secrets for someone to come and claim it. He had been crying because the debt was paid. He had been crying because of a woman who had smelled of lavender soap and walked a mile in 104 degrees on a bad hip with a wooden cane and a red leather handbag, and had sat down across from him and said, "I need a bad man," and had been right about what she needed and right about where to find him. He had been crying because she had come to the door, and unlike the door he had stood in front of in 2001, unable to knock, this one had opened. He had opened it. He lifted his hand from the tank. He looked at the cross-shaped scar on the inside of his left wrist in the light of the garage, old now, the edges softened by time but present. Still there, still readable to anyone who knew that the mark of a man who acts without waiting to be certain looks a great deal like the mark of a man who simply grabbed what needed to be grabbed when the situation required it. Ruth had her tattoo. He had his scar. Outside from the shop next door, the sound of the grinder stopped. Then the sound of a door. Then footsteps on gravel. Then silence, the morning quiet of the desert, absorbing everything and returning nothing in particular the way it always has. The fluorescent light hummed above him. The chrome of the fishtail pipes held the light. The road went forward. Some debts are paid in dollars. The ones worth paying are paid in something else entirely, in the showing up and the staying in the hand, extended across a sticky table to a woman in a floral dress who walked a mile to ask for it. In the knocking on the door you should have knocked on years ago. In the sitting beside the bed until the monitor says what it says, and the sitting continues anyway because presence is not contingent on the presence of another. In the carrying forward of a midnight blue gas tank that a 24-year-old man filled with everything he could not carry himself and trusted to the keeping of time and metal and the possibility that someone eventually would come looking. Someone came looking. She always intended to.